The cast iron stove, we did it. It hasn't been lit in 70 years. We lit that bad boy Tuesday night. We cleaned it. We put a top on the chimney. We had a lighting of the chimney day. So we lit that thing in the back corner. It was a great success. It gives off a ton of heat. It's crazy how much heat it gives. So that was a great success. And we are well. I'd be curious, Seth. I hope you're doing well, sir. Sartori, good to see you. Jockin, good to see you. I've been thinking about honestly if Main Street has been killed as an economic indicator because incentives have keeping Wall Street up as more important. Because if people believe the economy is good, they keep spending, or that creates the perception that things are healthy. And so it's literally the simulacra of Baudrillard at the extreme now. Because if you'll notice on the econ numbers, they keep revising each quarter. We've been in a recession major, but it's through revisions. Like yesterday, I think today, the numbers came out, blew them out of the water. But then I promise you, in about 3 months, they'll revise them. And it turns out the economy is really bad. But what happens if all of the economic indicators constantly say the economy is strong? Does that actually finish the ultimate dream of being able simply through simulation to keep an economy going, where it's been entirely decoupled from the reality? And then the question becomes, what actually happens to an economy if Main Street has literally no indication to Wall Street? Does that mean at that point that everyone better off for that? Or is only the people who own equities better off for that? What does that do to the economy? I mean, all the growth in the economy is now in the data center. So you actually have this interesting thing. And I'll throw it to anyone to speak about anything. I'm still extremely interested in root and rhizome and so on. And then anything anyone's talking about. I also think we're seeing all of the growth. Freight, the freight rates are up. Trucking is back up. Trucking was like collapsing because of the data centers and the amount of industry and different things. That does seem to suggest all the growth is in the AI world, and that's kind of Nick Landian and so on and so forth. So I hope those data centers they're building don't give off terrible noise and make people sick around them and lead to us all in, all of that different stuff. But then again, as Sartori's been working on, there could be ways AI can help with social coordination. So we'll see. So I've been in a world of looking at econ just from being on the ground, seeing how terrible the economy is for average people and trying to understand, how the Dow can be at 50,000. But it's all, hey guys, the Dow's at 50,000. They said it couldn't be done. It was done way quicker, as we learned in Congress. But I'd be curious what anyone's thinking on this fine day.
Well, to jump in, I guess. Use your favorite saying, Daniel. Stuffing grounds, good times. So I think the big note is the asymmetrical distribution pattern that AI, these kind of objects of social abstraction tend to have. So I think that's what I'm chewing on, because when I hear these stories of, again, this bipolar kind of stratification, right, on Main Street versus Wall Street, I think even as in education, I'll tell you from teaching, and it's a phenomenon that did not exist. It did not exist at all for years. It was only recently it started showing up, and the fact that it was in multiple professors in multiple majors in different disciplines in different kinds of schools were all pointing out. Now we're seeing this extreme, either all A's, like basically a bimodal split. There is no middle. There's just a virtuality in the middle. And that's basically what we're hinting at with this simulacrum discussion, because technically, as long as you're saying, like basically the people that have the cash have the judgment, they think they're safe, then yeah, that's all that matters. Typically, I mean, all classical thought would say this is a disaster. Like it's a guaranteed disaster. Aristotle's on politics says it. If the middle is not there, then that's where all the strife happens. Political unrest happens when this happens, when that middle is no longer being supported. So it's kind of interesting because it leads to a question like, what is distinct from now that's different from the past? I think that simulacrum split is a big one. I think ultimately the question becomes, what is the forcing mechanism that brings the virtual abstractions down in contact into particular circumstances? I think one aspect, I mean, we talked about this privately, is when energy costs are no longer projected on their futures, but actually have to be at the ground level dollar price, right? That adjustment happens. That's not a retroactive, like that's an update, but not retroactive the way you're talking about for the jobs results, right? Where they make an announcement and people jump on the sizzle about it, and then they quietly change it later and no one's looking, so there's no reaction. that kind of change where the energy costs now explode will completely change dynamics. Because I think you hinted at it in a private chat with me, Daniel, the idea that when gas is $4 a gallon in the East Coast, and I think it's $8, $9 on the West Coast. But when it's $8, like I can imagine in my head, my decision making and how I act will be very different. If gas was $10 a gallon, it's going to change behavior. It's not, isn't it? So the abstractions no longer apply because now it applies to a real contact, to reality. We were already hinting at this slightly, actually with the AI centers many, many months ago about, for example, almost all the old municipal areas that had data centers installed, guess what happened about 6 months later? Energy costs went up. Like the electric bill exploded up. So these are all having downstream effects that are going to have impacts eventually. But that's the catch. I think basically it seems to be the energy of, well, who cares? As long as the abstractions go up, it doesn't matter. But I think classical thought would always say this is not, you need this middle. But everything that has a social structure that's artificially abstracted tends to work the opposite way. I see this also because any kind of intellectual capital has a polarizational quality, right? An all or nothing kind of polarization. So this is not necessarily just an AI problem. This is, I tend to find this is any cultural object has this tendency. So it's almost the chewing on that in a political sense is do you either go the kind of Pareto principle and just say, well, that's just how order is, and that it's okay, or do we say we need to basically have an equity response to get the middle back, to restore the middle, and not have it be a virtual middle instead? I don't know. This is my first thoughts about that.
It's very interesting because the thing that Keynes in the general theory wants to stress, and I do think when Austrians critique Keynes, and many other critiques are very valid, there's also a bit of a misrepresentation of the key problem that Keynes is concerned about. And the key problem is this. If people think the economy in the future sucks, then it sucks. And if they think in the future the economy is good, then they act in a way that makes it good. That it's almost an observer effect in a way. Like you cannot separate projections from present action because of investment and capital allocations and so on and so forth. But here's the issue. What if people have like they're misinformed about the future, or their ideas of what's to happen is overrid with emotion and stuff like that, right? Well, then they're very bad ideas of what the future are going to be that easily could be misinformed and simply based on fear will actually have them act in a way that makes it thus. And then they'll be like, see, we knew it. We knew the economy was going to crash. That's why we acted the way we did, when in fact it was that very behavior that created that problem, right? So what ends up happening is you have to have a control. Like there's this weird thing that Keynes is pointing to that I think we're literally kind of at the extremism of this, in a sense, contradiction, because I do think there's a kind of contradiction at the heart of what Keynes is talking about. And in a kind of Hegelian sense, it's the idea that literally, if data, economic indicators show that the economy is getting worse, then those very indicators change how people behave. It would almost be better if you didn't even have the indicators, because then they may actually not think that things are bad and take risk and invest and believe that it's going to go somewhere and so on and so forth, and therefore you'd be better off. So there's a weird way in which the very presence of economic indicators can be almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, where because you have those indicators, and I'll give it to you, I'll give it to Seth and then you, Mr. Satori, and like when you have this indicator that can change how people behave, that then makes them say stop investing, that then actually leads to the bad future coming about. So should you lie? Should you hide information? Wouldn't that almost be benevolent? Like if the economy is getting worse, but the very knowledge that it is getting worse thus makes it get really bad, maybe there's something to be said about a noble lie, right? Maybe that's what we need to do, right? And rather or not, someone, and there's way more to be said on this argument, and the key indicator for Keynes is interest rates. If interest rates are low, that signals to people the economy is going to be better or that they can invest, and thus it makes it better. And he actually says almost verbatim in the general theory that the name of the game is to keep the economy in a quasi-boom. Notice he says quasi-boom. He's like, to always be on the verge of collapse. Because if it's always on the verge of collapse, it never collapses. And in fact, that always being on the verge generates the most economic well-being, right? Now, of course, the great Austrian critique of Keynes is this contributes to the split, the loss of the middle, just how it works. Now, why exactly does it? There's many reasons. I've also been reading up on the history of inequality in Williams' book, The Great Leveler, and the inequality as a historic reality all the way to prehistoric man is extremely interesting. And there's also seemingly differences between non-zero sum equality and zero sum inequality. Like there are differences here. And the major question is how a society, which will inevitably have some forms of inequality, assures that this inequality is non-zero sum, that it somehow benefits everyone, not just the people of whom are at the top of it. But how do you do that? What exactly does that mean? But the main point is that this Keynesian sort of idea of the observer effect, in a very real sense, would suggest that you want to kind of almost play a game. It can suggest a kind of a game of making sure your signals of economic data do not contribute to the very collapse that you don't want, right? But here's the $1 million problem. And this is why, of course, the number one argument, which is fitting, that many Austrians or Milton Friedman or people like that, and keep in mind that the split between Keynesianism and Austrianism, although online, is often portrayed as a hard divide and the two sides hate one another. You have people like Friedrich Hayek saying Keynes was the best man he ever met. You had Milton Friedman agreeing with him on the Federal Reserve. The stark divides between conservative and Keynesian economics is not as stark as people often realize. It's often a disagreement at points of government action, not any government action at all, and liquidity cycles and blah, blah, blah. But the point is that the number one argument against Keynes is stagflation, which, of course, happened in the 70s with what? The oil shock, which if there's any indicator, there's a sense that the reason why is because this works until real goods catch up with simulated goods. When you simply can't get oil, like when there's no more projection about its potential value. Keynesianism works until the day when there's literally not anything at the gas station. When you literally can't get it out of the ground. Well, then there's nothing to speculate. You can't play any sort of game with economic symbols because it's literally not there. And you see, we've been going such a long time of basically successful simulacra in a Baudrillard sense that, and here's the other issue, it's so unlikely that you have these massive shocks to the supply chain that you would be forced to have a collision between the simulacra and the actual, that then when it occurs, stuff goes out the window. But theoretically, if you could always kind of put off the actual occurrence, the real events, would it work? But then I think what ends up happening is someone ultimately pays the price. I do think it tends to trickle down to lower classes and things like that. But it's very interesting to think of the simulacra, kind of Baudrillard economics and economic signals and the things that Keynes is talking about versus Austrian. Simon, wonderful to see you, sir. It's a complete delight. I hope you are doing well. I'll throw it to Seth here and then Michael, and then if anyone has anything to speak. I was just talking a little bit, Simon, about if Wall Street has anything to do with Main Street anymore, thinking about the logical end of Keynesian thinking where economic signals are an observer effect where they create their own destiny. And I also talked about we finally cleaned and lit this cast iron stove in the back of the garage and we had a holiday. So that was grand. But let me throw it to Seth here. Seth, good to see you on this fine day, sir.
Good to see you, Daniel. Good to see everyone. It's funny, typically when the question of the economy comes up, I tend to just disqualify myself from the conversation right away. But I'm like, oh, when Daniel talks about it, he talks about it in a way that relates a little bit more to my world. But to your initial question about does Main Street relate to Wall Street, I think I've been ignoring every statistic about the stock market and jobs for decades. And that might just be my own personal, living in a little bubble. But yeah, I mean, if the stock market goes up, I don't tend to think, oh, good times for me. If it goes down, I don't tend to think, oh, shit. I think you're right. I do worry when I see the gas go up, but that feels like just a reminder of everything that, impacts me that is completely beyond my control. So if I get in a really fearful place, it is when something happens like the gas prices or, you know, COVID and the crazy experience of there's no toilet paper at the store and stuff like that. And that really brings up for me the question of disablement, because I know there's all kinds of things that I don't know how to take care of, but for the most part, those are taken care of for me. But every time this kind of stuff happens, I think, oh, maybe I'm really going to find out which things I wish I knew how to do that I don't know how to do. And at times I also think that might be interesting, because when it comes down to it and I need to do something and I don't know how to do it, what will I do? I will probably turn to the people I know in my life. And maybe we'll teach each other. Like maybe we'll work it out. Like there could be that aspect of some sort of disastrous situation. Like I think, I'm trying to think of is it Tyson Yunkaporta who wrote, he talks about that, you know, when there's a disaster, that this is part of what happens. But yeah, but just sort of on that basic connection of Wall Street to Main Street, I was just having a conversation with a client, and this is a conversation that I've had so many times, and when I was the client and someone else was coaching me, we had this conversation many times. It's for the entrepreneur. Well, what is the dream of the entrepreneur? Be your own boss. But then, okay, so who's in charge of productivity? Who's looking over my shoulder? It's me. Okay, so how do I decide if I'm a good person? Well, what did I produce today? Oh, I didn't produce anything today. I'm not a good person, you know? And then ultimately it's to actually try to unhook from that whole psychology, right? Whereas, you know, if, I mean, so I don't have a 9-to-5 job right now. And maybe if I did, it would feel more visceral to me when I watch the stock market, because I might think it's more likely that I'm going to be laid off or not. But it's still, you know, the security of my 9-to-5 job can also be the security of doing something that feels mindless and, you know, that I'm just enduring day after day because I got that paycheck. I got that paycheck, right? And it's really interesting when you talk to entrepreneurs, it's like no one's telling you what to do. So can you just do whatever you want? And one of the exercises that I've learned is like, if you had $1 billion, do you actually know what you would do with your time? And a lot of people don't know the answer to that question, right? And I think, anyways, it's maybe going a little far afield, but to me, that's been why part of, you know, rightly or wrongly, I have just sort of ignored all the Wall Street statistics for so long because they just feel so irrelevant to me. And it's like, how can I organize my life in such a way that I would actually enjoy myself? And yes, I know that I need to pay the rent, but if every time I worry about paying the rent, I start adopting the same kind of, you know, mode of being that I had when someone else was looking over my shoulder, it's like, well, then what was the point? You know, I might as well go somewhere where there's a paycheck every Friday, unless I can actually not only quit the job and start my own business, but I can actually shed that idea that the only way to be productive or the only way to have a livelihood is to sort of like ignore my own well-being day in, day out and just, you know, grind things out. And, you know, the other thing that I think that, Danny, you've often talked about in relation to economics, which is, again, like when I heard you say it, this was the first time that economics started sounding relevant, is like the question of energy. So if we can come, you know, to a place like the net and maybe feel, I don't know, I'm a little tired, but then we get talking and like the sparks fly and then I'm getting energy from that. Oh, okay. If I can organize my day to do that, you know, maybe that's what I'm looking for. And just one other thing that back, I guess, to the big picture, what came to mind with when you were mentioning, is there any reality between Wall Street and Main Street, is, you know, this incident at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and now it's floating around, was it staged, right? One of the things I saw someone write that I thought was really interesting was they're saying, they went through some of the facts of what had happened or what's known or what people are saying about it. And then they said, I'm not here to support that conspiracy theory, but they said, do you notice how susceptible we are now, right? And with this particular administration, it's, I think, true of other administrations, but the amount of bending the truth that happens, it just gets to this point where, you know, like the general perspective, I think, that most people have towards any official presentation of truth is I think that skepticism is just higher. So yeah, and it's like I think that's the thing about the gas prices. Like the reason I believe it is I just had to fill up the gas tank, and I'm like, holy crap, you know, like, okay, that's real, you know, but numbers and like, oh, it's the best year ever, or, you know, we hit it out of the park this quarter. I mean, that all just feels like rah, rah, rah. Like, I don't know what to do with it. So anyway, I just enjoy being at the net, because when you talk about economics, I don't totally shut off. I can feel like it might still have something to do with me. I'll pass it back.
I think everything you said there is fantastic. I mean, there's a few things. I like what you're saying about, and I'll give it to Mr. Satori and anyone who else wants to speak. There's a few things, that feeling that everything is staged. Like there's this feeling that it's conflict of mind stuff. It's like, what's real, what's not. I think the proper response in a world, and I'll expand on this, and we've spoken about it, in a world where everything feels staged, the way to address it is to get good at making stages. And what I mean by that is space making, spaces where people come together and they have flows of conversation, where they present art, where they encounter, right? Like, we're in a world where everything is staged. It becomes very important to make stages, but those stages facilitate human interaction. And I think that also gets into, like, with AI. Like AI, if it was used in the spirit of making stages for social coordination, can be extremely valuable. But we're in an age where the problem is now everyone is habituated, the habitus, to use that sociological term, to create things that are staged, or to expect a world where everything is staged, right? So that's our habits, and that's what we expect, and it's making us all crazy, right? But if instead we said, no, how do we use this to make stages? And I'm thinking, Eunoia, space making, all of that different stuff, then that, I think, is really where so much of the work is now, right? And I think a lot of the feeling that people have, and I'll give it back to you, Seth, if you'd like to say what you wanted to say, sir, please, please, please.
There was just one thing you said that I wanted to resonate on about how we look to the future. So there's this fellow, Bruce DeMarsico, who was originally, I guess, a standard psychiatrist, but he sort of developed his own method called the option method, which is about how to be happy, basically. But one of the things he would say, and it's almost the mirror of what you said about, what the statistics make us assume, is he says, how would you feel if you knew for sure that tomorrow you would feel totally miserable? How would you feel right now? And it's like, oh, I'd feel miserable. And they just said, how would you feel if you knew for sure that 24 hours from now you would feel ecstatically happy? And it's like, anyway, I just wanted to put that in because I think that's totally true. There's a mechanism that we just project something on the future, and it immediately changes the orientation that we're in right now.
That is a fantastic example. I think that happens with people's jobs. They're like, I hate my job and I have to go there tomorrow, so I hate my life now. So, and that's the problem, is that your kind of future, it has this kind of structure where you can't, if the human does not live in a way where past, present, and future are divided. They are all actually interwoven and informing the now, if you will. And that changes what is now, right? And yeah, as a few notes quickly, I think we definitely do educate people. We don't educate people what to do with money, which sounds bizarre. We educate people to pay bills. Oh, well, that's what to do with money. No. So as to say something that I think every economist would agree with, rather conservative, liberal, whatever, the economy at its core depends on investment, the ability to invest well. And investment is that of which then grows and develops. One of the great problems is, I would argue, people like to beat up on the boomers. But one of the problems is the boomers were never educated how to invest. They just buy stocks, which you can call that investment. I think there's actually a problem with using the term invest as buying equities or putting in your Roth or your 401k, because we use the same word as investing for that as what the entrepreneur does when they buy a business and they try to start a coffee shop, right? The world is made by people buying a space and starting a coffee shop, or investing their time and energy in making a new stage or a new space, right? This kind of investment is the stuff that is actually what makes the world work. Certainly it's non-zero sum, but we use the word investment also to mean buying Apple or Nvidia or something like that. Now, I'm not saying that buying equities is quote unquote bad. I'm just saying that the word investment tends to be captured by putting your money into the stock market, which of course feeds a lot of the stuff we're describing, versus where older people have learned how to be able to say, identify good real estate and say, I could buy this and start something the community needs, right? Like here's the issue. Even if the older generation wanted to give back to the younger generation, there's a bunch of things. First, they haven't been trained that they ought to do that. You have an ethical issue, and Mr. Satori talks well on this in his work. But then you also have the idea that they don't know how to invest. And if they say wanted to give the younger generation money, the tax man gets them, unless you have a B Corp or something, right? So then it's like, well, the older people was like, well, I don't know how to like identify what the community needs and to invest in it and to build it up. That is a skill set. We train people. So this is my point. I think these are skill sets that entrepreneurs can learn, but I would argue that people with money need them, or they're not going to know what to do with their money. They're just going to sit on it. And or just put it in the stock market or whatever. And but the whole thing that Keynes is concerned about is what he calls like the vices of hoarding, like the vices of holding money, because he says that kind of kills the stock market, right? So we don't have an education system that actually teaches people how to invest money, therefore, in a sense, give back to the community, and it just feeds the simulacra. If the simulacra was in relationship with the real economy through average people who knew how to invest it in their immediacy and their locality, or to build new things, or so on and so forth, you would have a movement of money that would probably be not so much reifying a divide between Wall Street and Main Street, as they say, right? So we don't have people educated in how to invest, and we've also made tax systems that make it very difficult for average people to invest. They can give to charities, they can give to nonprofits, but that's assuming the nonprofits know how to do it. And of course, there's a whole lot of corruption in there, right? And then how do you know which freaking nonprofit is good, right? So educating people, like basically what I'm saying, I'll give it to Tori and then Mr. Jockin. And actually there was a lot more to say, because you said a lot of things that are really important, because I'm also want to talk about how I think basically the economy has for 30 years just been a global debt bubble where it's too big to fail. And so even it's a game of musical chairs, there's no chairs left, but if the music never stops, it doesn't matter. And it can go on forever. But the main thing is, I guess what I'll say, and then I'll get to Tori, is investment issues. Also, yeah, I think basically if all the world feels staged, one of the ways you'd fight that or create sanity again is to be good at creating stages. Like, this is a weird thing. If everything is staged, you need to get good at like creativity. And isn't creativity weird because you're making a fiction? You're making something that's not real. But actually in a world where everything feels staged, the fiction will feel more real than everything else. The performance and the art and the spaces you make will actually have more ontological reality, because you made it. You poured into it, and it generates emergent qualities and possibilities that are not there in a very real way. Like the act of creativity, which of course is a term that means many things, and we can expand on that I think actually becomes really necessary in a world for psychological health and all the other things we talk about, in a world where everything is staged. But then you need to have an economic, sociological system and so on that facilitates that. But I will stop, and I will give it to Mr. Satori, then Mr. Jockin, and then Michael, and then anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day. Mr. Satori, good to see you today, sir.
Good to be here. Good to be here. Man, wow. So we already went so many ways. I mean, I want to first say, like, what Mr. Jockin was saying there, that pattern is so present everywhere, of everything, thinning out to an extreme, and then like an underclass, really, or there is not a real qualitative middle. And then, even there was a couple articles that came out a while ago, one that basically divided up our economy as far as like people. And one was saying, like, if you have to use money to pay for all the things that you need, to really sustain like a middle class life or whatever we think of that, you have to be at a point where you're basically in the top 80th percent. So you have to earn more than 80% of the people to be able to afford everything that you need. Now that's just with money. So like most people will offset some of those things in some way. Like, you know, my mother comes and watches the kids sometimes. My work provides me with a vehicle, so we don't need to have two vehicles for the family. So we have those sort of trade-offs. But you know, if you have to pay for everything out of pocket, you have to be earning more than 80% of the people. And then the other article split it a different way, where it said 50% of all the wealth is held by the top 10, and the other half is held by the bottom 90. So you have a middle class that's between 80 and 90. You have a poor that's the lower class that's, you know, the bottom 80%, and then you have this wealthy top 10%. But none of them think that they're really wealthy because they all know a billionaire that by comparison makes them feel not so special. And you know, when it comes to investing and things like that, you know, in that entrepreneurial way. So like this is a problem where it's like me being overly scrupulous or trying to be ethical, because obviously there's a lot of things that people are doing to make money that are extractive. You know, anybody who's doing some kind of internet grift is a little bit, you know, it's a little bit, you know, you can do it in more good faith or less, but you know, at the end of the day, you're still relying on somebody else, you know, investing in you so that you can earn the money. But you know, that's not the only way to make money. But you know, I was trying to think like, what could I do to make extra money? And I realized that anything that I could possibly do is only in service to that top 10%. There's nothing that I can do to make money that will provide a competitive price or a better quality of living for anybody in the bottom 80% because of like the economies of scale and all that stuff. So, you know, everybody's beholden to Walmart or whatever for cheap goods, and the only other way to save money, you just do things yourself. So in that way, it's like rather than working for other people, I just fix things at my house myself, and instead of working for somebody else and then paying another person to do it, I just essentially paying myself to do it. And I think that the real problem is that the way that these kind of things gotten all split up is it's at the top is all things where you can succeed as like an individual. I mean, this definitely goes into like a lot of the online status kind of things. And so really what's lost is like the ability to cooperate with others. Like, and I would say one example is like, we don't really have bands anymore. Like people don't have bands. There's just artists, you know, and it's like, yeah, well, everybody can learn how to do all the things themselves. But, you know, like I like to play music, my creative, but I don't have a singular vision for music. I get inspired by working with other people. So maybe I can write some lyrics to come up with somebody, or I can play, you know, if they have an idea, I can help flesh it out musically. And that is like, that's the way where you can really get more out of your human capital, I guess. But we've made that so hard to coordinate, right? So that's why we need social coordination. But yeah, it's just it's very interesting. I'll just throw this in. There's an interesting on Luke's stream today. We were talking about somebody's son has made a business selling fake Rolexes on Facebook Marketplace, and we're just talking about, well, like first of all, I mean, a watch is purely a social stuff. Maybe not. Maybe I don't know. I don't see you wearing one. I know you don't have a cell phone, Daniel, but. So you're the one person that I know who could legitimately claim a need for a watch, but essentially they're status symbols. And a Rolex is certainly like nobody needs the quality. You buy it because it's a status symbol. But now we're at the point where a cheap one, if you can put it on your hand and be on a live stream wearing a fake Rolex, it's just as good as a real Rolex. If for the purpose that it serves. So, and so really, and in that sense, and because all you need is the name, you don't even need the quality. There's no point in having quality anymore. So, yeah.
That's a good point. Like if you're just doing the stream, it doesn't really make a difference. Frick. Ah, man, I'll throw it to Jock and Michael Simon here. Well, a few things. First, there is this major problem with the best paying jobs or whatever that you need in order not to be in debt forever and longer. Seems to have you serving large corporations and companies. This is where, again, I think I am strongly of the opinion that basically the problem with modern economics is a conflation of stimulating demand and creating demand. There is a big difference between stimulating demand and people being of the subjectivity to create new kinds of demand. And that basically capitalism is only as good as the amount of creative destruction present in it, which requires people to be creative, to engage in making a new, inventing electricity and therefore getting rid of whale oil. Right? Like the less creative people are, the less creative destruction there is. And actually wealth is electricity, air conditioning, stuff like that, like stuff people create. Right. And also, if intellectual property rights tend to be owned by companies, even if they don't develop them, if it's very difficult to get patents, but easy for larger companies, then that's going to kill one of the greatest ways you can tear down big companies is not necessarily to compete directly with them, but to invent something better than what they have. Right. But then what ends up happening is they have, for these, like the problem with a problem with creative destruction now is it tends to be on the side of very large projects that only people with $1 trillion can do, say AI stuff and so on and so forth. And then if the entire economy goes that way, you have issues. But actually something that can be promising is you do see more and more DeepSeek or these new little innovations that are made that run the possibility of overturning the larger system. But then, of course, if the entire economy is now dependent on seven companies, what does that mean? And so on and so forth. I have more to say. I really love what you said about the band. That was really good. That is a great point. You don't see as many bands anymore, do you? That's really interesting. Everyone has like a solo career. That's really interesting. Like I said, I think, because on a band, you have to deal with people. Right? You have to like interact and deal with personalities. And we're more and more people that want to create everything all for ourselves without having to deal with the messiness of relationships. But if there's something about, and Sam, wonderful to see you. If there's something about the fullness of human creative possibilities that are actually found in the messy relationships, then this rational strategy of going solo actually is ultimately self-devouring. But I'll pause to Jock and Michael, and then Simon here and anyone else who wants to speak. Jockin, please.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's being brought up is two notes. One is, when we hear these examples of technofeudalism, this is exactly what we mean. That effectively, there's like 7 feudal lords that are just corporational, abstractional entities whom we have to bend the knee to, right, to get your cash. Because not doing that, there's such skimps of nothing available. You can't get, in terms of getting revenue, I mean, it's actually a rule of business development. Who has my money? Someone has to have your money to get it, right? And that's a basic principle. So thus, if it's large corporations, that's who you got to serve. And typically it's actually, you'll make a 1099 entity so that you can be subcontracted by the corporation. You know how many Amazon delivery people are actually subcontracted? They're not actually even under the regis, the protections of the corporate feudal lord. Healthcare, all the things like that. So it's actually really fascinating. We have all these tensions of feudalism being abstracted through, but you actually don't even have any of you get the worst of everything, basically. It's like every worst scenario just got played out. I say this because technically when a lord has lordship over you, they have responsibility to you. And that's actually still true even with the corporate, like the employer-employee relationship, meaning they supply you with your equipment. They, as Satori just brought up, like they can get a car. Like, for example, they can provide you a car, provide you tools and equipment and training, and they're responsible for you because of OSHA, in terms of health safety, things like that. Now, that used to not be the case, but that is the case now. So if you get injured on the job, there's workers' comp. Like versus you're 1099, you're self-employed. Nope. Yes, congratulations. You get the freedom to price as you wish and do your own time. but now you're responsible for your tools, your liabilities, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, because you have to compete with other 1099s, you don't even have the pricing power. You're actually getting compressed into a certain pricing point as a fungible widget, right, for certain goods and services. So you don't even get necessarily the upside of generational value, like producing value, right? You're basically stuck into, guess what, the employer deciding the value of your contribution, which is always the problem with hourly wages. Ultimately, it's a subjective judgment of the employer's call of what the value of your work is. The work of $10 versus $50 an hour or $100 an hour. Anyways, that's a point. The other thing is, I think, Daniel, your point about what, and there's also a lot, I don't know if you guys know, but online, there's a lot of there's a lot of generational anxiety or tension between the baby boomers and the millennials and the Zoomers. Like there's this rhetorical stance of the boomers don't get it, the boomers don't know, they had it easy, they have all this stuff. And partly the tension is that boomers say, well, just do the thing we did. But the problem was that was based on a certain context. It doesn't apply anymore. But the reality is that boomers do have statistically much more wealth. That is true. And actually, Daniel, your point, what my note in my head is that they don't have magnificence, the virtue. What I mean by that is the fitting use of resources, right? So, because quite frankly, they don't have that, which is an impoverished understanding and notion of the beautiful. That is what the magnificent is for. It's what the kalos, the beautiful. Because all the intelligibility of our culture is pleasure and utility. That's it. If it's not towards those things, which have fixed, clear concrete goals, the kalos has this kind of intergenerational, larger perspective that is excessive. Very much the things that anything of a gift economy or gift context has that. It doesn't seem useful at all, but it's actually the cause and generation of any utility and function in the future. So all this wealth is kind of gets stuck sitting around and just wasted away because there's no understanding of the kalos. There's no magnificence, let alone liberality when it comes to smaller amounts. Magnificence relates to a large magnitude or acts of beauty, basically, by the way. It could be not just works of beauty, but acts of beauty, by the way. So I think those notes really stand out to me when I'm hearing about this conversation. And then the last note is, and now I meant when we're talking about the nature of technology and the social objects abstraction, I talked about this at a panel I was part of at my university, where an individual was saying, "Oh yeah, like I want to do this thing, or I want to make an app for my child." So I went and asked AI to make the app. He's an English major. He's an English professor, and I brought it up. Like I want to point out. I raised my hand. It's like I want to point out that in this panel, there's a computer science major, like one who could make a website with you, like do that app with you, but you chose to use the AI instead. That's actually rational, because I brought up like most people, if you can get what you want without the friction of dealing with other people, why would you deal with the other people? It's not rational. So the rational move is to use AI and use the other aberrations like this. The only way you can counter this is some kind of dispositional state of friendship. It's the only way, because you have to say, yeah, my friend's annoying, and yeah, there's things about these tensions, but you know what? There's something worthwhile that's more important than the frictions of the interaction. There's something more important to be gained from doing this. So I find that, and that's the thing, is that all the intelligibility of the structure is solely not built around that. Because what's the logic of friction? The logic is smoothness. That's the logic. Remove all friction. Make things as smooth, as rapid as possible. I think the last note, I will comment that I think something very interesting about wealth, especially, it is true, it does change your subjectivity, now doesn't it? What I mean by that is when you are abject poor, the things of concern that are intelligible to you are very different. For example, if you're having a food anxiety, if you have insecurity of food or insecurity of housing, and and it's freezing outside, I got news for you. You're going to be really thinking about what's happening in the weather tonight, or where you're going to get your meal, the next meal. Versus if you're so wealthy that literally you could just Uber eat everything. Like as Satori just said, if you're at that level where literally everything can be, the help can just be mediated. You could just ask the help by the algorithm of money to just do that for you. Generally, I think a commentary about those wealthy individuals, especially if they don't have a really either a spiritual domain, like a very strong spiritual aspect of their life, or attention to beauty, they have that. So thus our relationship to virtue and the magnificence mode I'm talking about, they're miserable. They're literally in a haze state of just like their sense of dispositional attention is just gone. It's very interesting. I'll stop with that.
No, magnificent. I'll throw it to Michael here and then Simon. Yeah, it's like feudalism without the benefits. That's great. So, there we go. I think also what you're saying about, so this is all Ivan Illich, because he's like, rationality makes us disabled, because if you could hire an expert to build your house, why wouldn't you? And actually, if you try to build your own house, you're prideful and arrogant, and you think you don't need help, and then all the ethics are against you as well. So what ends up happening is rationality is towards smoothness, creating disablement, and then the social ethic actually incentivizes people not to learn to build your house unless you're going to get a job building houses. Oh, that's okay. But if you're going to actually learn skills that you're not being paid for, that's actually, in a way, a waste of time and even prideful. And so we're all disabled. And then we're at the mercy of whatever job. What that does then is you have no, I'm screaming. Then what that does is you have no versatility in your options if your boss fires you, because the only skill you have is whatever you learn to get that job. So you're at their mercy. The thing you were saying about poverty and wealth and things structuring subjectivity, this is extremely important. I don't know. I sometimes wonder. So I think, and we talked about it with the great Ecomancer, I think debt is a major, major structure of subjectivity in the modern world. And something that makes me concerned is that actually there might, in a weird way, be less incentive for policy makers to solve major economic problems, because if you're in debt and you miss payments, you owe more and then more and more and more, and you're actually further entrenched. Like, if people with money and power actually fix the economy, people could get out of debt and thus owe less. And actually, that would not be great, would it? Also, furthermore, for the people in power, that's really terrible. But I wonder about that. Because the majority of people are now significantly in debt to some degree, or they're living paycheck to paycheck. They're on the verge of debt and so on and so forth. Well, from a power standpoint or a political standpoint, this is terrible to think, but I do wonder it. It is always better for your people to be in debt than not, almost from a game theory dynamic, because I have power over you. And if you want to resist me, well, then I can get you to vote for me by promising to take care of your debts. Like, I have a card against you if you're in debt. Maybe I never use the card, but if you're in debt, I have a card against you, right? And then also the key to debt is debt makes your financial problems your fault. It's not that it's your fault. You paid, you got into debt. So then you can't get any collective action to bring people together to fight it, because in a sense, there's this kind of mixed feeling with debt where it's like, well, yeah, it's not good, but also I chose to take the debt. Yeah, but you also had no choice because of the zoning laws and certifications and all these different things. And then I guess the other point I wonder about, like, let's take the Strait of Hormuz stuff. And I know that's more complicated, and it probably has a lot to do with the meeting between Trump and China in a few weeks. I think May 15th or something. But anyway, there's this idea that if a rich person goes to the pump and they have to spend an extra $30 on a gas tank, that $30, it sucks, but they don't really feel it as much, right? But if a poor person has an extra $30, that's a big deal. And that's kind of the money, there's kind of the money multiplier problem there, right? Where it's like $1,000 to a rich person, they don't really feel it, but $1,000 to a poor person is a big deal, right? So what ends up happening is the things that actually, this is my point, the things that tend to kind of tip people into the debt world tend to be economic problems that people with money don't feel so much. And then when people are tipped into the debt world, there's actually incentive not to solve the problem quickly, because then they rack up more debt and they're more enslaved. And actually, you make more money off of them. The thing that costs $50 ends up being $200, right? So that actually may make there's this kind of idea that policymakers don't get anything done. Well, maybe that's a feature, not a mistake. Because if people are actually in situations where they need stuff to get better quicker in order to get out of their situations, then there might not be that big of a hurry. That's terrible. I'll pause and throw it to Michael and then Simon here. Michael.
Yeah, it's great to be here today. A lot of things were swirling around in my mind. Um, on that point of the fake Rolexes thing, it made me think of a good friend of mine from high school. He told me that uh, one of the people that we knew in high school who went to school for computer science at the same university as him, and they were roommates. He just created this startup where basically it's kind of like it's a AI that helps teachers detect when students are using AI. And so it kind of like trains like it's trained to like detect when you know like copy large groups of text and put it in and like your keystrokes and stuff. And I was like, "Oh, that's actually like, you know, just in the spaces that I've been in where there's been teachers, it's like a perennial issue now." And I'm like, "Oh, that's actually like, you know, pretty noble." And then and then he goes on to say that he's actually also created like it's kind of like a twin like sister program or whatever that helps students use AI but imitate real people when they so he's basically created the solution and the problem, and he's like cornered this market, and like there's basically nothing else like it out there. And I was like, oh my goodness. Like, and this was a guy who he did a TEDx talk for our high school on like the different ways of lying. And I'm like, man, just like the dot, it's like crazy to just like see how like the dots all like connect, you know? Um, and yeah, and you know, it just made me think of like the staging metaphor, Daniel, that you were talking about, how like, and I do have to go soon, but just how in, you know, in the world we live in, there's I mean, there's just such a, you know, kind of the loop in I think all of our heads when we see something absurd online is like, is this a deep fake? You know, is this real? Is this not? Is this orchestrated? Is, you know, is the secret cabal behind this like, or is this real? Like, is this true and something that I can believe in? And I was just writing an essay for school reflecting on this addictions class that I was in, and we had to watch this documentary on the war on drugs, and Daniel, that when you were talking about, you know, it serves the state to have people in debt because now, you know, now you're enslaved. It made me think of how, you know, Nixon, when he was kind of you know, drafting the blueprints for the war on drugs, like there's like audio tapes of him, you know, talking about like, you know, black people are the problem, and we have to basically convince the American public that you know, addicts and black people on the street are dangerous. And, you know, then you have the whole like drug industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. It's like all that policy making and just how we relate to addicts and how then they come to see themselves is like created with this narrative and with this story. And I'll end on this. I was at my local library the other day, and they have these chalkboards where they often write quotes, you know, often from like poets, and usually it's like very beautiful things, and sometimes they have like puns and stuff. And this one stopped me in my tracks. I was like, they have a little cafe, and I was eating as I was looking at it. The quote from John Adams, and he said, "The there are two ways that a country enslaves its people: by the sword and by debt." And you know, there's like kids like just like walking past, just like you know, um, and yeah, I do have to go, so I'll leave it there.
Oh, delightful. I don't think I'll ever forget the guy making the way to detect AI and then the way to get out of being detected by AI. That's grand. I'm sure you can get both. You know, that's a buy one get one free deal or something. I'll throw it to Simon and then anyone else who wants to speak. Yeah, on the debt, the new Jim Crow South book, talking about those topics and different things. Look, I mean, people need to. There was a long debate on the difference between wages and feudalism, and of course slavery and different things, also to just look at this historically, where basically people said the problem with wages is that, yeah, it's going to end up being feudalism without the benefits, actually. And then that will be your fault. And it will be your fault. So then the corporations and the businesses won't have any responsibility to it, because there's a weird way where what the argument was is on the feudal lands, in a sense, now don't push it, like in a sense you're owned by the feudal lord, therefore they have responsibility to you, right? And if the people on the land are mistreated or doing poorly, that reflects badly on the lord, right? That says something about the lord, right? But if you work for a corporation and your life is suck and you're drowning in debt and whatever, it doesn't say anything about the corporation, and they have no responsibility to it, right? So there's always, the problem is that when you get into these dynamics, there are always trade-offs between autonomy and freedom and social responsibility and who takes care of what and so on and so forth. And you see the problem becomes, of course, when you increase freedom of the individual, but they're still in a social context of which they still have to buy things with things you get from the corporations. If you had freedom and you're Ivan Illich, or you're really going like on the off the grid kind of thing, then that can be different. But when you have freedom and not going off the grid, you get this weird middle space where actually it affords greater and greater exploitation. And I would argue, even if you wanted to go off the grid, it just becomes increasingly difficult today, regulations and so on and so forth. And I think all of that, yeah, and again, it does make me think as well on the boomer question, on how also basically this just ultimately creates an ethic where, in the same way the corporation has no, the corporation doesn't have any responsibility to necessarily make sure you can pay for your debts, you have an ethic where the generations don't necessarily need to take care of one another. And furthermore, it almost feels like, I mean, you can flip this and basically be like, for boomers, it's like, actually, it would be irresponsible for us to give the younger generation money. That would be disabling them, because they wouldn't be making their own way. They wouldn't be learning, you give a man a fish, but that's not as good as teaching them the fish. We're actually helping them, right? We're actually helping them. And you see that libertarian logic, I have great sympathies to, but the problem is that it is very difficult. The wealth in the economy is increasingly assets, not wages. It's assets. And assets are not plastic. There's only so much land. There's almost so much parity that you can live on, right? Like money you can print, and theoretically money can be non-zero because there's no necessary limit to it. Wealth is created is the claim of a McCloskey and many Austrians, is that wealth is created. And there's a certain sense in which, yes, wealth is created. But land, there are many assets that are the most value that you can't make more of. Unless maybe we go to Mars or something. But I don't think living in Mars will be as valuable as Hawaii. But anyway, if you have assets being the main grounding of the economy, and that is not flexible, then what you need, or you can't print more territory, then what you need is people who own the territory thinking about how to invest it in a manner. They have to actively make it non-zero sum. The argument of Austrianism in smart libertarianism is basically capitalism is fundamentally non-zero. You can't get wealthy without benefiting everyone else, right? And that argument is very true if you bracket out assets as being non-reproducible. The problem is, as an economy moves in the direction of things that are limited in their own being, like land, I'm trying to think of a term, you can't make more of, there's a limited amount of property. The more you move in that direction, the non-zero sumness of the market cannot be assumed. It has to be actively stewarded by the people who own those things, okay? The boomers own those things, but they have not been taught how to actively steward. The entire ethic in the training zone has been about non-zero sumness in terms of wages and making money and building up and so on and so forth, right? And the non-zero sumness of capitalism is, the Austrians are correct, that you can't make money unless you are giving something to someone that they want, right? That's generally true. And of course, there are exceptions once you get to externalities and so on and so forth. I understand that. But basically, that logic is to a fair degree valid. But the more and more you're talking about assets, the more and more the non-zero sumness cannot be assumed. It has to be actively stewarded. But we have an entire generation that has not been trained in that active stewarding and not trained in that investment. So the things that that are worth the most now and the most important, housing, blah, 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 are concentrated. And here's the problem. If you don't have a place to live, it's hard to even enter into the non-zero sumness of wages because you don't have a place to live. Or if you start in debt, it's hard to enter into this. So there's a lot more to say on that, but I'll throw it to Simon and then Sam. Simon, it is a complete delight to have you today, sir. I hope you've been doing well.
Excellent. Yeah, fun to be here. Following Seth, like economics, there's a lot of things that my brain does grasp, but economics is often like it just completely goes flat. I've no structure or legibility to understand any of the models or math, or even when it's explained to me. So I think I'm a man built for a different time, and I'm hoping or aiming for a different time. And it's funny with the boomers and the holding on to the wealth and all this kind of stuff. It's like, let's say that the really wealthy, they do feel a responsibility towards their young, right? Often the most rich people, they got a starting loan from their parents or from their family of X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars or euros or whatever. And it's like the generalized cultural structure that this doesn't seem to exist. And it's indeed older generations who are like, yeah, we don't want to take away the pressure, the libertarian pressure for people to make their own money. And it's like, yeah, but if you grew up in a clear-cut forest, or in a forest that just has been in a conflagration, like the Second World War was, then there's a lot of space to soak up sun, right? So you have a lot of seeds, and then, yeah, everybody can grow really fast, and there's a lot of nutrients everywhere around and a lot of sunlight. And now we have a lot of shitty old trees blocking most of the sunlight, and then we have saplings trying to do something, but can't catch any rays. And then it's like, well, you have to make the effort to yada yada. Main thing I'm interested in, and that I often try to do as a sort of thought experiment, is to go with the mindset, what if nothing's wrong? What if this moment in cultural development, and I want to see the humanity as a multicellular species that has embedded itself into a field, a form, an organization of a civilization. What are the major organs? What are the things that are sucking up most of the energy, and where are those flows going? Are they just creating a lot of fat? What is happening with these energy flows? And what is happening to all the people who are desperate for energy and who have the most creativity? And who have, I think, also the most vision, who aren't getting any. Like, what is happening there? Are we looking at a mushroom growth, which at a certain point will just sporulate and then let all the spores go, and so novel organisms may form somewhere else? Are we looking at forming of seeds and just having a very juicy apple around it? How is this intergenerational exchange or flow going? Because obviously it's not going, but there's this glut increasing. There's this, what is happening there? Is the value at some point still there? Because in Europe, we have many countries like Italy and France and Spain, where you have a massive urbanization. So most people moving to the cities. While at the same time, you have a big graying population, which means that all the villages that are there, like ancient villages that go back hundreds of years or less or more, are mostly populated by super old people who are dying. And then farmland is left untended. And there are sort of incentives to get young people back to those places. But if you want to sell vegetables on a fruit market, yeah, you can do that locally, and then you can probably resource yourself and your community. But if you want to compete, you can't. You just can't. So what larger organisms are you competing with? And yeah, then getting back to the point of like, what if nothing's wrong? What if we're in a space where we've been so alienated from one another, from family, from other individuals, from community, what is left then to turn to? I'm often thinking like, okay, what is then left, and what kind of space opens up, and what kind of potential orientation for novel forms or organizations come? And then we can use the cliche, by now cliche, but I think very apt metaphor again of the imaginal cells within a dissolving caterpillar. Novel cellular structures are then organizing these loose cells which can diversify into something else. So maybe we need to lose form first, and then slowly but surely we'll have the decay of these other larger structures, and which will allow more towards, well, something that actually makes sense. And this whole diatribe can be done without knowing anything about economy and just about counting coins, indeed, because I don't get any of that. So
absolutely magnificent. That was wonderful. I'll throw it to Sam here. And Guy, what a delight to see you, sir. As you were speaking, well, one of the things that give me hope, I think increasingly we will see. So we will increasingly see this technology, the social coordination mechanism, being used so that young people can say, for example, go to these farmlands, or say in Japan, or these different islands, and actually have connection with the cultural conversation, better coordinate traveling with people, and actually have access to the cultural capital. Because a lot of the reasons why you've had cities or colleges are due to coordination problems. Like, the only way to be part of culture making or culture creation or the conversation was to basically go to these places that gathered people together, right? But that led to the problem of the owning of assets, of which are not non-zero sum, like wages, being controlled by certain people, and you had to own property near the university to be part of the college, which then automatically contributes to the problems of inequality, or so on and so forth, right? And you could also say that boomers, so Guy, we've been talking about boomers and stuff, and also economics and freaking gas. So we were talking about that, but there's also something where many of the land and property that would give you access to the cultural conversation right now and is owned by boomers. They are the ones who can afford those cities and different things, right? And that changes it. It should also be noted, like, to on that idea of like on boomers being like, well, young people could be enabled if you kind of give them things. I think the key understanding is the strategy of getting a job, working it for 50 years, and then retiring assumes stability of technological condition. We're seeing right now where people went to college, they got into debt, they did everything they're supposed to, and they're no longer needed, right? This kind of rate of technological change, which is becoming more and more pronounced, was not a factor of most people of the last generation on average. And as a result, the kind of idea of getting a single job, keeping it, and going for a long time was completely valid. But the problem is now, increasingly, because of the rate of technological change, you need to be able to move quickly and get new jobs and learn new things. But here's the problem. The cost of the property that you need to move around quickly is going up in value, and it's more and more difficult, right? Like, if assets and houses and things were cheaper and you suddenly had to get a new job in a new city, well, that would be one thing. But where you buy a place and you like where it is, and then suddenly you lose your job because of technological change, you need to move to a different place, and there's more and more of a concentration of the high-paying jobs that are not being taken in the same corporations. Well, all of the property around those corporations is extremely high, and that is a technological, that is an economic situation unique, right? But I think what can happen now is these logistical and coordination problems, because pricing and money are coordination technologies, right? They're like languages. They help coordinate action, they help move energy, and so on and so forth. Capitalism has had a pricing mechanism, but it has not had a social coordination mechanism. And the pathologies of capitalism follow from not the inherent, what I would say, it's not that capitalism is inherently bad, it's that it needs actively fast, ineffective social coordination. So you have just as much of an efficiency in how people interact socially in terms of the great conversation idea creation as the movement of resources. But if you have to live in New York to be part of the social making, that is ineffective. Whereas if I could be in Japan, buy up this land, have farmland, and also be part of the conversation online, well, that is now a movement of flows. Capitalism is no better than its flows in a certain sense. The ability of ideas to move, you don't have monopolies, competition. We've been able to do that with material, but not with ideas as effectively. Ideas have been trapped in logistical problems. And as a result, that has contributed to a race to the top, where the people that the people who are able to afford the property in these areas also tend to be part of the best culture making, and then culture gets associated with having wealth, and the whole creative spirit dies, and other stuff like that. So to me, it is very important to have social coordination alongside pricing mechanisms that change the entire character. But let me throw it to Sam here, and then anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day. Sam, it is wonderful to see you.
Hi. Yeah, I've been thinking about this probably because in Canada right now it's the tax deadline, and I've been doing my taxes and just thinking about my own personal like financial literacy and my relationship to my wealth and to my familial wealth. I grew up in a really small town, kind of on the bad side of town, and a lot of the people that I knew were, you know, I think coming and myself coming from families where a lot of these problems that we're talking about here are extremely relevant and pressing. That town now is like on the edge of a wine district. In the last 20 years, 15 years since I've been gone, it's sort of gentrified significantly. A lot of people from Toronto go there and buy up businesses and land, and it's become a wine region. It's caused a lot of affordability in the area is very low because of this for a lot of the locals. And I want to push back a little bit against what I think is kind of a forming consensus here. Like, you know, like I see what I saw in my hometown was a lot of people had a great opportunity for wealth in a coming change that was bigger than them. They were a part of a currency weather system that they didn't know anything about and they didn't want anything to do with. But nonetheless, like it's kind of the way, you know, if a storm's coming, you can prepare, but you don't get to choose if it's coming. And likewise, a bunch of Torontonians came to our area, and we don't get to choose that. Like, we're part of this larger system. And what I saw was a lot of, farms, families, people with low financial literacy. They would sell their properties for what they thought was a really good amount of money, but which was not near the value of the property in the coming years. And they sold, and then often got pushed out of the place where they had a really deep belonging. And that caused a whole slew of social problems above and beyond just money problems. And then you have a bunch of new people coming in, and they're generating wealth for themselves that doesn't stay in the area. It goes back to the city predominantly. So, I mean, this is just a microcosm of what we're talking about at this macrocosmic level, I think. But having known a lot of these people personally, and I think there's the emotions with which we think are really not an ancillary part of the problem. I think the emotional tone that we bring to thoughts is really participatory to the thinking. I think when I saw people in their rationalities and in what they thought was possible with their own means and the world around them, I think they felt cornered, but actually they had a great amount of opportunity, and probably all they just needed was vision, right? If those locals were able to hold on, say, parcel their land, hold on to a bit of it, sell, take a portion of it and sell it and use that to cover the fees of further development. There was so much opportunity, and a lot of it is just really came down to a lacking vision, maybe not even a lack of education, a lack of acceptance about what the future held for them. And then also just laziness. And I don't think it's really good to sort of romanticize poverty and these things I lack some sympathies sometimes because I grew up in that milieu, and I just think you just see people complaining, and no, that's not everyone, of course, but it is some people, and it is a part of the emotional social milieu of the issue. Anyways, that being said, when I've been doing my taxes, I've been thinking like, gosh, like when I was a kid, there was I had a boomer parent, and there was no precedent for how to how to manage my money, or like really even like applying to university was like a whole process that I was just thrown into the deep end with, and I just had to figure it out on my own. And the thing about being thrown into the deep end is that you often just learn how to not drown, which is very different from learning how to swim well. And so a lot of like what I've learned about thriving and about flourishing has actually come from the internet. And Owen has this piece on he calls it the enclosure, and it's a really great piece. Wrote it a couple of years ago. It was about the boomers and like what's with them. TLDR was like, it's TV. And that seems a little simplistic. Like, why is it TV? But actually, I think a lot of if we go to a metamodernist lens on this, and we say metamodernist in the more of the not in the Denver sense, but in the Dempsey sense, all of life is a sort of learning process, a universal learning process. And when we look at evolution, evolution is a learning, but then there's also cultural evolution that occurs, the passing on of techne and of know-how. This speed runs natural evolution and changes biological systems considerably, and the world just in its very materialistic sense. And when I think about the kind of cultural evolution that occurred between me and my boomer single mom, there just wasn't a lot of preparation for the future that I was going to encounter, right? There wasn't a lot of cultural evolution. There wasn't a lot of passing on of know-how. And I've had this sense this morning, holy crap, I think my life really started, I really started to learn about the world when I left home. And then I had to learn to cook, and I had to learn to do my taxes, and I had to learn to all these things, just general know-how, and I'm really grateful that actually I was sort of I think I'm glad that she almost didn't teach me anything, then taught me a boomer way about doing things, because they really just learned from TV, it seems. And the cultural evolution that the cultural evolutionary processes that they were a part of, it seems like they were built in, their worldview was politically sort of insulated, was insulated by a larger political agenda, a larger regime that, again, there was a fiction about how the world worked that was so strongly emphasized to them. And I think we're at a moment of that breaking. And I think those of us who have accepted sort of the breaking, it's kind of like that Gandalf quote, we don't get to choose the times we're in, just what we do with them. And it's the same with people in my hometown. They didn't get to choose this sudden winery boom, but they could have chose what they did with it. And likewise, in the larger system, things are breaking institutionally. But I think the people who chose to sort of accept that, and then for me, it was a process of going online and trying to learn things like fringe health practices, that actually now when I look at my own health outcomes in relation to the health outcomes of people I went to high school with, I'm pretty glad about what I learned and the cultural evolution that I was a part of just on the ground that's serving me. And now I'm thinking about my financial literacy, and I'm oh, actually I'm an adult now, and I can relearn these things. And I think it's actually better that I have the opportunity to learn them from something of my own first principles, and a sort of skepticism towards the sort of ways that things were when they were only that way out of a post World War II fiction. So, anyways, this is all to say, I really think obviously a lot of malice occurs in the container of business practices, and a lot of things which, anyone with some ethical spine might not accept of their own conduct. nonetheless, there's a lot of people out there who are very successful, who are not malicious, who are trying to make things better. And like, I mean, the whole thing is a weird game of chess. Like everyone's actions are interconnected. And I just think it's like a very easy, I would hate for us to, for you know, for us after our boomer parents who were raised on a TV idea of how the world works to then try and cultivate an equally reduced fiction about how the world works, which just says like rich people made this all bad or something, right? And I think and the reason I bring that up is because I do think to a certain extent that is happening on mainstream social media. And yeah, I feel like this is a place of subtleties and complexity and nuance.
Absolutely magnificent. Thank you very much, Sam. And Andrew Luper, good to see you. We've been talking a bit about the economy and et cetera. I think what you're getting at is extremely important. Yeah, like things like Thomas Sowell will point out that inequality, you could talk about the 99% and the 1, but if the people who make up the 1% is changing every single year, then those are categories, right? Not necessarily individuals, right? Furthermore, you could argue inequality, and I think the book The Great Leveler shows this, inequality today is probably just about equivalent to what it was in the Roman Empire. Inequality seems to be quite constant at a certain ratio, and it's equalized by what he calls the 4 horsemen: world wars, failures of state, pandemics, and bloody revolutions. And he's like, hey, if you want to get rid of inequality, careful what you wish for, because there's a way to do it. It's just really bad. And so the question becomes, and this is what I think many people like Schol or others will point out, the question is, what is the quality of the inequality? Is it non-zero sum or is it zero sum, right? I think it's also extremely important not to romanticize poverty and suggest poverty is always a result of quote unquote injustice. So we'll talk about the problem of cosmic injustice, and also the idea that it's very problematic if you assume a good economy is one where there's quote unquote equality, because it is not even clear what is equality. And you can get equality but destroy dynamism, competition, and so on and so forth, right? So that all of those things become very problematic. On what you were saying about opportunity, you know, also, I love that idea that not drowning is not the same as swimming well. That's freaking great. I'm gonna remember that. That's gold. I guess one of the things that I think also too, the lack of financial education. Michelle and I talk about like the lack of financial education, tax education. I think also a point that you're getting at. We personally were always, and I, you know, mystified by the lack of people thinking about the idea of getting a job as a plumber or a construction worker or stuff like that as being a valid option. Many people, I will say, if I'm sympathetic to people, like I just know, like to speak personally, when we came back and started living in small town USA, the amount of people that basically said, you're wasting your life, you have no potential now, everything is over, the social rejection in like 2014 or whatever is through the effing roof. And the idea of also, it used to be this, what you're saying, Sam, to me, I think I will say, I think it is easier now. I think there's a degree where it can be, I think the likelihood that people see their local communities or places as an opportunity with the internet in the way we're using it to give them vision is much higher now. That's a reason why I really believe in this technology as a social coordination mechanism distinct from the mere internet, because you're showing people visions and models. And I'm now in Lynchburg, Virginia, able to talk with people all around the world. It really did feel like if you moved here in 2014, you were out of the conversation. And it wasn't, you know, we were in Eunoia, we were running spaces, festivals, we were part of art galleries, we did all these things. And yeah, you're out of it. And you're working in a wholesale and loading trucks. And you feel the loss of that participation in the culture making. And it sucks. Oh, man, it sucks. And it wasn't until really 2019 where this kind of operation really started to take, that a alternative arose for the possibility of being in small towns and having connectivity with the larger picture was there, and it was easier to have the vision. I definitely think there is major economic opportunity in looking to these smaller towns or blue collar work or things like that, and because and bringing it together with the life of the mind, if I speak very generally, because the problem with small town USA is, I agree with you, there's a lot of opportunity, and it should also be noted that there are many rich people. Like for example, if I think of rich people in plumbing, construction, they're like really great people, and they're not bad. You can do very, very well, right? In those different fields. And I think there is the issue is small town USA is prone to and Simon, thank you for being here, sir. The problem with small town USA is political extremism. Getting taken. That's the whole, like, for me, the moment of horror with Common Life and David Hume in 2016 is like seeing all the potential in small town USA and all the different things that could occur that ended up when the political movement or extremism or populism kind of swept in, people were just swept away by it and very manipulatable and alienating anyone not like them and those different problems. So the problem is small town USA, or I want to say Common Life, has many, many advantages in the way that you're describing. But without the social coordination mechanism, they were very, very prone, and I think still very prone, to political extremism and getting captured in various bubbles that are very consequential. Now we can bridge that because you're able to live in a common life and have exposure with people who, like most, unfortunately, a very high number of conservatives basically think of liberals as the devil now. Like, if they're liberal, they're basically evil. That's how people think, because they don't, in their small towns, encounter liberals. And liberals think conservatives who vote for Trump are evil because they don't encounter them, right? And to get the benefits of a small town, you tend to have to put yourself in social and geographical settings where that is what happens to you, not because you necessarily plan it, because that's the kind of secondhand smoke you absorb. Am I saying that's always the case? No, I'm not saying that, but it can occur. And that was a kind of problem that had no effective means of coordination to deal with, in my opinion. Well, now we have the social coordination mechanism. And the more and more we do this, the more you have people using this space to do in real life events, like you'll see on the TLC or the liminal web, different things. Like, the more and more you're helping bridge the potential of the small town with the cultural capital of the large city and making a kind of rhizomatic network, to allude to that, what Simon was saying. More to be said, but I really appreciate everything you were saying. And thank you very much for sharing it. And I will throw it to Mr. Sartori here and anyone else on this fine day. Mr. Sartori, please.
Well, I've gotten in some areas a little reputation for talking about the boomers, but really it was because I encountered like the meme of the millennials, you know, like the okay boomer thing, and I didn't understand it at first because my experience from my own parents, my dad was a pretty unsuccessful boomer, financially speaking, at least. In contrast to he has two older brothers that did very well for themselves. But, you know, I kind of went and tried to figure out what it was. And I think, you know, think that metaphor that Sam used about learning how to not drown instead of how to swim. I think if you look back at the generations preceding, you know, World War II, it was just crisis after crisis after crisis. And then it was like, there was such a disconnect with the prosperity that came because these children, like, the boomers are like the first generation to ever really have what we consider a childhood now. And they were getting a lot of maybe harsh messaging from their parents. You know, you need to save, you need to prepare, you need to do all these things. They were getting all this stuff learned from a long history of crisis pounded into them, but the crisis wasn't coming. And I think more than that, when they, you know, having the time to question, like, why do we do these things? I think they'd been just passed down out of necessity for so long that they lost the explanation. There was no reason for the tradition. You know, it was just the form of tradition without the underlying, you know, like, you just think about how this goes, like, religiously or whatever, you know, church is it's just a cultural thing we do. We just go, that's what we do or whatever. And I think, you know, yeah, it is kind of funny how the term that I coined was boomerality. And it's, you know, so the moral like code of the boomers, it's all about excuse rather than, you know, like real repentance or real taking of ownership or responsibility. So it's all, I won't judge you, judge not, you know, that's their favorite verse. And it's just, you know, yeah, don't judge people. Judging people is like the highest sin. And you have to make sure you don't judge others, because that's the only way that you will be safe. Because if you don't want to be judged. And the sad thing is, seeing like a lot of people from my generation essentially just flipping they're doing the same thing. They're just flipping the equation and now blaming their parents for everything and blaming their parents for not equipping them. And I felt these frustrations, and I felt like, why didn't my parents push me to achieve success in certain ways? Or they didn't get, I felt disabled by a lack of wisdom that I received in some areas, particularly financial. But then, come to realize like, oh, well, I think the system that created the wealth of the boomers is fast receding, and so it may be very much better to not have learned how to succeed in that environment. It's difficult now, but it's very much more advantageous to figure out what is the thing that will work in the future, and hopefully what are the things that will really work permanently, the things that are really central to human flourishing. That was kind of the idea with the book about building cultures that last. And so, so all that to say, I think in some sense, it would be amazing. Like the miracle, I think, would be for and I have seen it happen in small doses, for the boomers to own their mistakes and say, we have done you a disservice, and to reach out to their kids. If they won't do that, it's still on the millennials to just forgive your parents and don't hold it against them, because I think they really couldn't help the mistakes that they made. They came by them honestly.
No, that makes me think of it, wonderfully put. The various generational historians will talk about the silent generation basically not passing down anything. Instead, just passing down. There's a difference between passing down values and passing down a program that is toward values, right? So going to church can look like having the value of going to church, but actually it could just be the program of what one does, right? And that's all well and good if you're in an age of givens, where you don't have to be, where it's just what everyone around you does, right? But the problem is and then therefore you can have an ethic of non-judgmentalism, and like someone like A. Conyers would say, an age of tolerance but there's a difference between tolerance and humility. And he argues we're doomed because we conflate those. Well, we're in big trouble. Tolerance is where I say, you're different from me, but I'll tolerate you, right? By not judging you, by not making any claims or whatever. Humility, and then I'll throw it to Mr. Guy Senstock here. Humility is when you go, you're different from me, therefore I have something to learn from you. We have an age of tolerance, not humility. Global pluralism will only work if we have humility. If you have tolerance, then we're screwed. Because eventually something's going to happen that that brings out difference. We can't handle it. And difference was never something I learned to deal with, only to tolerate, and then you get war, right? So you have to believe difference is something to learn from versus something to tolerate. And the issue is, you don't need judgment so much if you're not encountering complexity or things that don't fit into your program. You don't have to actively judge what you ought to do in a kind of virtue ethic sense, right? And for the boomers and for the silent generation, that worked fair enough. It practically was efficient given the sociological, economic, and coordination state of the world at the time. Now, you increasingly have to actively discern your values, how to operate in complex situations that don't fit into programs. And I think what you're saying is there is a tendency of the young to, you could say, scapegoat the boomers and basically say it's their fault instead of you learning how to swim, as Sam put so wonderfully, or learning that discernment. But then there also is an issue if it's a two-way street, right? Because if boomers don't also see themselves as the world has changed and I need to invest my resources to actually facilitate the next generation, that could be a problem. But then there's also a problem with overly scapegoating. So I appreciate very much you were saying, but I'll throw it to Guy Senstock. Mr. Senstock, it is a treat to see you, sir.
It's good to see you too. I'm working with Daniel Zaruba and Tom O'Hallen. Is it O'Hallen? We're going through and reading a paper that they translated, I think from German into English, of Ivo de Janeiro's work, called Plato and the Economic Problem. Seems like a really kind of just simple thing, right? Like play with an economic problem. It's like we're getting through maybe like a half a paragraph, like every hour and a half. I haven't recorded, I haven't uploaded any of them yet, but it's because you know what Evo does is it's really interesting. He's super rigorous about what he means by philosophical interrogation, and what basically what he does is he just starts to interrogate a word and into its etymology and its history, and that unfolds this entire thing, right? But it was interesting, you know, what like Plato and the economic problem. The way I understand it is that for the Greeks, the problem the economy was trying to solve, and I think it's important to remember this in terms of the roots, because I still think we're in it, which is essentially comes down to this: I work so that I have scole, as they would say, right? Or like grossly badly translated as leisure. I work, right, so that I can have leisure. And then, of course, in Aristotle, you have this grappling with the contradictions in that, the paradoxes in that, right? But what they kind of understood was this central notion of scole, right? And as you go deep into that, it's stunning, right? It's stunning. So, for example, well, distinguish it from our modern sense of leisure, right? So, you know, we kind of look at it now. It's like, okay, there is time, right? And then there's time that we work, that we fill by working, right? And then we work so that we then have a vacation, but it's the same kind of time, right? It's just it's devoid of work, right? Whereas the Greek had a very different sense of it, right? Where for them, and as you know, I think it was Aristotle who said, like, you can only do theoria in scole. You should only do, right, geometry and or mathematics in scole, right? And I think it was Socrates who said, actually, you shouldn't kill me. Like, you should pay me to be in scole all the time, or something like that, right? What do they mean by scole, right? It's not what we mean by leisure, right? Scole was seen as a particular relationship to beholding time itself, right? And if you go into I can't do justice to the layers of etymology to it, but basically, if you look at one of the roots of scole, it's a root that basically means holding, right? And so you can kind of think about, like, when you're in scole, there's a relation to time that you have, that your relation to time is a way of holding time, in turn the time itself holds you in a sense of sufficiency. Like this time, where time itself, right? And Evo makes a really interesting point. He says, without leisure, there is no time, right? There only is time, right, in scole. And it's so interesting to think about that, this being the original sense of the economy, what the economy was for. It preceded it, right? It defined it. It like when you were working, right? You were working already for the sake of scole, right? So it has this kind of, and it's another way of saying it is, it's kind of like there's a sense of where scole is that place where you're not doing anything useful. You're not doing anything that's going to, like, as I think Johannes said in a video not too long ago, he says, it's a strange time when me, a philosopher, has something timely to say, right? That this notion of contemplation, of philosophical inquiry, was not solving a problem, and it wasn't practical. In fact, this was the peak of being being a yes to what is so. While you are in direct relationship to it holding open its sufficiency and holding you in its sufficiency, right? That sense of things. That's why there's money. That's why there's the economy. That's why there's everything, right? That sense of things, right? So, in so many ways, I'm kind of hearing, I've been kind of listening to everyone talking with that just kind of central in mind right now for me. And it's so interesting that that in some sense, like the economy is still trying to do that, yet the kind of time it takes over, right, and the kind of time it takes up, right, is the same kind of time that it's trying to solve, right, in some way. So there's some interesting ontological things going on here, and it just seems like money seems to be perhaps the most incredible means there is. It's like the most powerful means there is. It's like virtually the worst end. Like it's a catastrophic end, right? It's like what happens when means itself, like the most purest means, right, becomes the goal and end, which is, by the way, where all the wealth are with people who have made it their end. That's all I have to say about that.
Magnificent. Yeah, I agree. Money is the best means, but without the right end, it's going to be your end. And so you said a lot that is extremely important. Yes, I believe that basically economics has forsaken that its function is Scholē. It has forgotten that it requires the presence of creativity, a sense of value distinct from the commodity form. And basically, I think the economic argument can be made that the reason why we stimulate demand and conflate that with creating demand is because we actually don't realize that what generates the conditions of possibility of wealth are ultimately Scholē. Because Scholē is the conditions in which the dialectic of creativity and energy that generates value are best realized. So let me explain what I mean by that. And also I would say that the issue is the pricing mechanism has not been very good at coordinating the conditions of possibility for Scholē. We need a social coordination mechanism, to effectively coordinate the conditions of possibility for Scholē. Because Scholē, as being distinct from merely taking a nap, is, as you said, a certain beholding and dwelling in time, and you could say beauty, and I think it's energetic. It creates a certain energy and so on and so forth. It is not self-evident how to create that. I would argue it requires people. It requires relationships. But the kinds of people because people, as also being part of the end, can be the worst of things because they can be the best of things. Everything that can be the best of things can be the worst of things precisely because it has the capacities to be the best of things if disordered, right? That's why people will die for one another, and then people are whom they are just make them enraged, like more than anything, right? Because of that potentiality. And the issue is it's been very difficult to effectively coordinate people together who have reached a certain conditionality by which, if they come together, there will be an experience and revelation of Scholē, of which then helps you figure out how to bring it into your own life, independent of those communities. And then you create a positive feedback loop, right? We've created feedback loops with businesses and material and pricing mechanisms. We've done all that, but precisely because that's such an extraordinary means, when it doesn't have with it a social coordination mechanism of Scholē, that means becomes the end, and it becomes the worst of things. But the very technology that generates the pricing mechanism has also given us the technology for the possibility of social coordination if we would only own it and use it that way and commit to it that way, right? And I think so much of the work now is believing in what you're already doing. Like what we're already like many times it's like, do we do something different? Like another thing I often think about, it's very important what you're saying. Very often I think the problem in life is not always necessarily finding joy, but keeping it. Like I think people find joy, they're just not able to keep it, or they're not able to maintain it, right? Like people have moments where they're satisfied. They have moments where they're like, man, I could do this forever, but then for some reason they give it up, right? Because you didn't give your life over to that thing then. Right? You kept yourself disordered, right? Like so much of, I think, what actually ultimately has a big impact is when people commit to something they're already doing, more than finding something new. It's actually believing that thing is worth continuing. and working on and investing in different things. Now, that has to be expanded on. I think it's somewhat developmental. I think when you're young, you have to send out and find. You have to look and do new things. But as you get older, you need to move to a commitment that then is the work of, instead of doing something new, learning how to renew. Because renewing is different from doing something new. Renewing is where you take something you have and you make it new. It is like a constant kind of revelation. I think Scholē is when you relate to the things around you that have always been there in a manner that feels like a constant renewing. I don't think we get Sabbath or rest, quote unquote, unless we feel like everything around us is renewing, right? And I think basically doing something new at a certain point in one's life moves into dopamine hits if you're not careful. And that doesn't mean traveling and all that is bad. It's all an order thing, right? You have to do all things to get all things in the right way, right? You have to, if you never do new things, you're insulated, and that's very problematic. But if you only do new things, you never move into the developmental work of renewing. And I think you actually are then in a frenzy and you don't get that Scholē, right? I actually think there's very, very good reason to think, and then I'll throw it to Sam here, on economic theory, that basically economics does not work without Scholē. The key example is Robert Solow's The Solo Residual, which what that means, what that basically shows is if you go through and try to explain GDP simply in terms of all the main economic indicators, productivity, demand, those things, demand, you still have, like, there's still like a very large, up to 50% you can't explain. It's called the Solo Residual. That 50% is creativity, social relations, and technology. Whoa. Are you telling me that up to 50% of the economy is not explained by any of our models? Yes. Like, people like agree with this. Wait a minute. You're like, maybe 50% of our economy is due to fluffy stuff that you're told isn't going to get you a job? Yes, it is. I would argue that the Solo Residual is precisely the space of Scholē. Like, people who are creative, like when you look at the biographies of creative people, they're hanging out and having freaking book clubs on Friday night. Like, they're meeting up at Virginia Woolf's houses. They're having like apostles meetings. Like, they're doing all these kind of fluffy, organic interactions that don't seem like they do anything. Yeah, apparently that generates, and the internet's getting bad because I'm screaming. But that apparently could make up 50% of the economy. McCloskey basically says the Great Enrichment from the 1670s to the 1800s, which basically made the modern world. And she goes through, it's a very important book she writes on the bourgeoisie virtues. He says, the reason the Great Enrichment happened is when the average person started becoming a tinkering engineer and inventing air conditioning or better ways to plow or whatever, is because the average person started basically talking about ideas with one another in the Dutch Empire. They changed how they talked. Like, not science, it's when people started talking in a new way, that creates a kind of subjectivity that then turns people into people who make wealth, right? And she said the two things is that work, and then you had a value change. Work has dignity, and people should be free to work. And if you put those two things together, the communities kind of glide, and people are excited and coming up with ideas and inventing things, right? Oh, okay, so you mean to tell me the Great Enrichment that made the modern world, that raised the standard of living for everyone in insane ways, was due to people basically gathering in bars and talking about ideas and believing that ideas mattered and they should be free to work on them? Yes. Ties that very strongly to Scholē, because Scholē is that condition of a renewed beholding of where creativity emerges, daydreaming happens, right? So the funny thing is, so this is the great irony. Scholē made possible modern economics. I think it was ultimately what I would like to argue. Scholē made possible modern economics. But then modern economics got very successful and forgot the core of Scholē that made it possible. And the means then tried to function at the end. And thus, economics became less freaking enriching. In the name of getting rich, it lost the very source that created wealth. And that's where we are. That's where we have the great stagnation that Tyler Cohn talks about. Schiff, you have this kind of concentration of innovation in certain sectors because you actually have lost it. So I think everything you're saying is a big deal. And I think you can actually very strongly argue that based on Solo, McCloskey. I think the problem of demand and Keynes, you can show that there's this massive incompleteness in economic modeling that requires Scholē to make up for it. So very important points, but I will stop and throw it to Sam here and anyone else who wants to speak. And Clayton, wonderful to have you, sir. Sam, please.
Yeah, I think this is really what it comes down to. It's really like it's the meaning to all these measures that we've been discussing. Like, it's very easy to measure the economy. It's really easy to measure a lot of things, and it's very hard to understand. On my own personal life, I've just been very busy. I've been taking a lot of work that I love, but that, like, I'm sort of like, oh, I'm really tired. I'm really stressed. Like, why am I doing this? Like, and then I'll like, you know, probably be pondering this in like a public place. And I'm like, that person doesn't look happy. Like, why are they doing this if it doesn't make them happy? And I think so much of what we do is just time. And I, again, I'm really glad you brought up time, because it's like, it's hard to break a continuity and to, you know, like slow down enough so that you can make the really tight corner, right? Because otherwise you're just going to blow right past it. And I think this this recognition of types of doing in the classical world also has a sort of modern update in Hannah Arendt's, although I haven't engaged in her work in a while, but she has the concept of, like, I believe, labor, work, and action, labor being, and I really think that if you sort of parse her work, again, it's been a while since I've actually read it, through your ideas on time, it seems like, of course, time only occurs in Scholē, because labor is certainly cyclical. You know, I sweep the floor, it gets dirty. I sweep the floor, it gets dirty. That's eternal. There's no line there. Like, you know, time isn't elapsing. You can't have a historical arc with sweeping the floor. You know, you're going to hit a certain level of innovation, and then sweeping the floor is just going to be maxed out in its efficient, productive, and creative potentials. But then you get into works and further into actions. And then this is where things like the constitutional dimension of thought come into play. And that's where, you know, things get really creative. And I was recently watching some, you know, Instagram reel about marketing or something. I don't know, but I forwarded it to a friend who is an actual thinker when it comes to the economy. And I was like, how does this make sense? And he sort of explained to me the difference between value creation and margins. And this is another thing where, like, we forget the distinction between Scholē and other forms of work. We also forget, like, the distinction between margins and value creation. Like, there's lots of what we do that is actually really contributing to the world, and then there's lots of ways that we make money that are not. They're just really high margins. And we, you know, like, again, that's a sort of spandrel panel of in between the cogs of the economy that you can exploit, but, like, you don't actually, like, do anything in the world, but you know. And one thing that I actually, in this little Instagram reel about marketing, was brought up that I did find very interesting, was this idea that a lot of marketing relates to people's loneliness. This guy said, lonely men buy sneakers and lonely women buy water bottles. And that a lot of what the campaigns that these companies put forward do is address from the backside what he identified as thwarted belongingness. And that's really horrible, you know? And so when we're thinking about, you know, work, like labor, work, action, or like Scholē versus taking a nap, and we're trying to parse all those finer distinctions, one thing that I have sort of like thought about at the intersection of like forms of doing and forms of being or belonging is, like, recently, and I mean, you spoke a little bit to this earlier, but it was around the same time frame, Daniel, around 2019, when we hit the pandemic. Like, prior to that point in my own life, in retrospect, I realize now that I had been really lacking a type of relationship, because I think we really take for granted that relationships are the techne of its society. Like if you just look at other cultures, especially like other more culturally distant cultures, like even things such as family structures, you know, we don't have moitiés of indigenous communities. Like there are forms of kinship that humans inhabit and naturalize to themselves, which we understand as completely like foreign and unnaturalized. But so I think it's wise to remember that the way that we structure relationships is a form of technology, and like a social technology. Anyways, it's all to say that I realized like there was like this like form of relationship I had personally been really lacking in my life, and I identify it now. I would name it fellowship. I had a lot of friendships. I had a lot of acquaintanceships. I had coworkers. I didn't have any spiritual allies, and I didn't have any fellowships. I had no groups of people that were aimed at some sort of like higher or creative good, whether that's simply, whether that's doing actions, not just works or labors in pursuit of those higher goods, whether that's engaging in a sort of collective or joint attention scholē, wherein those higher goods are described and essentially invented, discovered, which is sort of a constitutive mode of engaging in thought. It was through the internet that I was able to find people with whom I could engage in the world in that way. And actually very recently and a lot of that, I think that work has become manifest in my life through a giving up of old values, which I think, you know, is a sort of process that we're talking about, creating a discontinuity with the practices of the boomers. Like, you know, that is like giving up old values and old customs because the givenness in which they were fitting is no longer like our social substrate. But at any rate, yeah, I recently applied for a job with Praxis Nation, and right now, just over the course of our conversation, I was sort of imagining like what would have happened in my small town if they did have a form of social coordination that was somewhere between a city and like a municipality, you know, as a form of government. I mean, all this is to say that, like, I know that the reason that most of the people in that community didn't take up the opportunities that were presented to them in the point in time that they were situated and the place and space that they were situated is simply because they didn't want it. They didn't want that future. They didn't want gentrification. They wanted things to be exactly as they were when they grew up. They loved the farmland. They loved, you know, they didn't want a bunch of tourists. But like, there's no current way to stop them. This isn't a Grecian city-state. You can't like put up a wall and be like, get the hell out of here. That's just not a feasible way to act. And so, you know, like they see their neighbors selling their farms, so they're going to sell their farms. But I feel like, you know, I'm imagining they had established some sort of like Praxis-esque network state, or an like Praxis calls it, or the network state, the book The Network State calls it like an archipelago state. Basically, like, you know, everybody who was really committed to the spirit of keeping things the way they are, of not letting the tourists like buy everybody out, they could have, you know, created a sort of community union, so to speak. And there could have been just and honestly, this is just a fiction, just a commitment to a future that said, hey, I'm not going to sell my farm. If you believe in this, don't sell your farm. You know, like we'll act together and we'll figure out, we see this coming. But all this requires a huge amount of, like, again, coordination, awareness, acceptance of what is actually happening, you know, like a good forecast of like how the future will probably go. it's like completely almost an intelligence game. I mean, every organization plays an intelligence game, right? Like yeah. Anyways, that's all very rambling. And to say that maybe had they had a little few Socrates-esque farmers in their fields, who was doing a little less labor and a little more action, inactive action, then I don't know. Or maybe had all this occurred maybe later in history when, I don't know, tech was a little bit more, was disrupting things a little bit. Maybe we wouldn't have the little city people haven that my hometown currently is.
Magnificent. And none of that was rambling at all. And I think you're actually getting at a lot that's extremely important. So first, for me, a lot of the stress on philosophy of self-defense is also tied to when the idea comes to sell your farm, you don't. But you see, often this philosophy has something to do with unzipping, like a zip file. And let me explain what I mean by that. When somebody says we shouldn't sell the farm, then I ask why. And you see that premise is true. If theoretically everyone coordinated their action on that premise, that would give you the end, right? So there's a sense in which you don't need the complexity. You don't need, if everyone just did the thing, you'd be good to go. But here's the issue. You yourself may not know why and not have confidence in it. Philosophy, there's a weird way, there's many things. There's something about philosophy, as I'm defining it here, as this unzipping of a file, that is about creating confidence that if you get that confidence, you're not actually going to go anywhere. You're just going to be able to do the thing. That's what it's actually like, to actually stay in the thing. So when you're like, we shouldn't sell the farm, for example, and then the why question shows up, if you're not able to unzip why, then you're not going to get people to stay committed to the thing. If you're not able to respond to economic concerns or social concerns, and this also all assumes that you're able to speak with people. People haven't been trained to speak with people about hard things or listen, as Guy is stressed, right? So if you're not able to do that, then forming a cartel, and I don't mean cartel as a bad thing, that can be an economic term, a group that is able to actually maintain itself becomes very difficult. But also, philosophy, the question is, what is philosophy unzipping for, right? The problem is philosophy. So this is where philosophy and deconstructing, I would argue philosophy becomes this deconstructive thing versus unzipping when it lacks a vision. Because you're like, you can always ask why, right? And therefore deconstruct, right? The reason why you're supposed to deconstruct is it's not really deconstruct. Deconstructing and digging have the same motion, right? When I deconstruct, I tear something down I raise it to the ground. When I dig, I leave the things alone, but I'm trying to see what's at its root to actually then understand the whole of it, right? So there's something different about that. Well, when you're unzipping a file, the thing is, this is where I think what Guy's saying about Scholē is a very big deal, because basically we don't want to sell the farm because this is a space that uniquely affords Scholē. And without that, we're not human beings. We can get all the money in the world, but we won't know what to do with it. We can have everything we ever wanted, but we won't have any wealth. And there's something about land and community that uniquely meets the conditions of possibility to afford a certain experience of life that if you do not have, you can get all the money in the world, and what you're going to use that money for is doing things to distract you, or kinky things, or extreme things, as we see evidence on certain files that people do, right? Well, that's what follows when you don't have Scholē. You actually go in that direction. And so philosophy, and I'll give it to Guy here, and actually now I'm thinking about how I was being cynical on the spread of debt. Now I'm also thinking about the spread of loneliness as also being like advantageous to the system to get you to buy things. So that's no good. There is something about, like that's also an example where people are going to get their belonging, dang it. But if we don't think belonging again in a new quality, in a new way, then they're going to get belonging in a very problematic way, as we've been discussing. So we need belonging with the social coordination mechanism in a world that enables people to be able to speak with one another, and that changes the education system, of which actually my argument would unleash wealth creation, because in the history of the world, it's precisely been relationships as the social techne and the ability of people to hold them and to articulate them that explodes wealth. And that explodes. So it actually would be, the irony is, if we do these things, it would be good for the economy. And yet the economy doesn't do it because it's not practical. So what ends up being practical is self-destructive. It's great. Also, like, what happens is philosophy, you need philosophy. philosophy is like a fire extinguisher, and we've said this before. You don't need it all the time, but when you need it, if you don't have it, the consequences are dire, right? So when you get to that moment where people are going to sell the farm, or you're deciding if you're going to live on the farm or like maintain the land or maintain the community, if you don't have philosophy in that moment to unzip the file of why you should do that thing, then you will deconstruct it and you will make a decision that you may not be able to undo. And then you will spend your entire life trying to get back to the conditions of what was before that decision that you had. And therefore, you'll be trying to get back to an Eden you walked out of. And so this becomes very problematic. And at those key moments, if you have the ability to philosophy enables you to articulate a vision to a collective. Like if you have the vision, but you can't share it with others, then you might not be able to get all the other farms not to sell. You may not sell, but they'll sell, and then they're building apartments that screwed up your property tax. Property tax is also another reason why people do this. Like property tax is terrible. It's contributed to this problem dramatically. And also too, just the fact like who's going to take care of the property if you're not there, getting the social. So there were many things to say on that. But the idea is if you are not at key moments able to articulate a vision to people, to others, then even if you do the right thing, you will be alone in it, and then the economic realities will shift and so on and so forth, right? So that ability to do that is really important. I'm quite a fan of fellowship as you're describing it with a vision. It makes me think, I've been reading a lot on the history of friendship and philosophy. Cicero, Agamben has a lovely article, Aristotle, obviously. They all basically say, like, they basically say without philosophy, friendship's impossible. That's what they all say. They're like, the only way to have friendship is philosophy. And you're like, what the heck? You philosophers, of course, would say that. And they're like, no. Because philosophy is the only way to have a vision that is not reducible to a materiality, that transcends materiality, and therefore can condition you in all possible states of materiality, that create a relationship that is not contingent upon something that can end, and can unifying you over the things. Ergo, friendship's not possible without vision. And they're like, if you get rid of vision, by getting rid of, say, philosophy and the ability to articulate vision or to unzip something that contains a vision to make that vision pronounced to you, then you won't have friendship. You'll have acquaintances, but you won't have friendship, ergo in the way that you're meaning fellowship. And actually, I think it would be extremely important to do an economic history of the correlation between the presence of fellowship and economic well-being. Because I would argue that societies that do very well in fellowship also do very well economically in a way that is more non-zero sum than zero sum. I can't prove that at this moment, but I think it's a big deal. I'm now thinking about the phenomenology of Scholē, but I will pause and throw it to Mr. Guy Senstock. Mr. Senstock, please.
I thought what Sam said, or the insight that you had about fellowship, right, as a distinct thing that was missing, I think is a keen insight. And it seems to, because what I've come to realize, actually, what I've been doing, of course, like everything in my life, I find out what I'm doing well after the fact, right? Like, there's what I think I'm doing, and then there's what I'm actually doing, and what I'm actually doing, like, comes to me as obvious the whole time when I see it. But like, in some sense, I've been realizing a lot of the work that I've done in the practice of circling is precisely honing in on that very thing, a intimacy, right? That's a fellowship, a phileic intimacy, right? And what's interesting about this, and I'll get it this way, like this thing that happens, like when people first come to like a circling event, right? We do these kind of structured practices or exercises at the beginning, and they're usually like, just say a certain sentence to the person across from you, and it puts constraints around the way that you attend, right? To kind of like dive deep in a particular capacity and exercise it. And so it's usually a bunch of people that don't know each other. They go off into these rooms and they face each other, and then they go through this practice. And inevitably, every single time, someone who's never done it before comes out and says, I can't believe it. I just had a conversation that was deeper than I've ever had with my wife or my mother or my da-da-da. They're like, it's mind blowing to them until you start to think about it, right? If you start to think about it, actually, it makes a lot of sense that would be possible, right? Because, essentially our nervousness, our anxiety that comes up in the face of a stranger, right, is really, really intense, right? For damn good reason, right? Because you're looking at a whole vat of snakes that if they knew about, they probably even wouldn't tell you about, right? Like that would only come through once you get into a relationship with them, right? So that's a really extreme thing. Maybe the exception to that are people are like highly extroverted, right? But most people have this sense of like, oh, stranger, friend, foe, like, but it's not that thick. It's really strong, but it's not that thick. And essentially, it's like when you just kind of get, oh, that this person, we're basically playing the same game. We're sharing the same normativity here, right? It goes. And now you're with somebody. Check this out, right? Where actually you have no binding history to uphold. You have no structures of relation of what's good or not good or bad or not bad. It's like you have simply another human being, and then you find out that you're free. And you hear yourself saying things that you didn't know that you knew, right? Being ways and showing up in ways that you didn't know that you knew, right? And it's the sense that I think that in itself is why fellowship, right? Because when you think about when you accompany somebody in fellowship, the thing that you're actually vulnerable to, if you will, is the matter upon which you've all gathered around. That's the thing that you're facing, that you're vulnerable to, right? Whatever it is. And oftentimes in fellowship, your history is probably pretty light with the people. However, you're both before something that matters, right? And you're not bound to a relationship in which you're trying to maintain its existence through time, right? So I think this is why philia, Sophia, right? Like why it doesn't say agapic Sophia or eros Sophia. It says philiac Sophia, because I think it's got this fellowship sense. And I think that is so profound, right? To get and to understand. Anyways.
Beautifully said. Absolutely beautifully said. I think what you're getting at there is where, for me, the loss of givens is opportunity. But it's also a very, very big challenge, because you said something very important, which is this idea that it's super powerful, but it's also very thin. There's kind of this idea in Christianity of the notion that actually kind of the more powerful evil appears, that actually the easier it is to defeat, or it's on the verge of defeat. I froze. But I think what you were just saying is really, really powerful, in the sense of there's this idea in Christianity that the more powerful evil is, the actually easier it is to defeat, or that it's right on the verge of defeat, right? Like the devil's greatest success is his failure on the cross, right? So there's always this weird thing that the more powerful and difficult the thing is, that the more it probably only takes one step to defeat. The less powerful it is, it may take 5 steps. But if it's super powerful, there's just like one move you need to make, right? But that one move is super hard to do. So to me, as you lose givens, you unleash anxiety. But the presence of anxiety is actually a thing that if you can get through, you get freedom. You get more and more freedom, because freedom and anxiety go together. So if you can take the one move to face the other, that one step, then that actually creates a lot of potential and a lot of power, right? So anxiety is a lot of potential. There's a lot of energy there, right? And if you step into it, then rather than that energy destroy you, it kind of projects you, actually, right? So anxiety and freedom go together. So the only way you're going to get freedom is to go into anxiety, right?
Yeah.
So the stranger is a real opportunity for freedom. But also that freedom is only on the other side of an anxiety that you don't feel with people you know as well, right? And part of the issue is basically, if you're in an age of givens, then this is a large claim, but I'll give it to Clayton here, and then if anyone else has anything to say. If you're in an age of givens, then the social economic condition is such, probably it's going to be task-based, where the thing that binds people together, because global pluralism correlates with a movement from everyday life being task-based to voice-based. You know, it used to be the community could be gathered because we're going to get clean water together. We'll do the hay bales together. We'll do tasks together, right? And also these tasks clearly have very direct stakes. Like I need clean water or I'm not going to have clean water, which would be bad, right? You could say people try to recreate this on the job site, but you see money is a step away from the reality. So there's an abstraction which can actually impede the sense of a clarity of vision, and everyone's going to use their money in different ways, right? And also on the job side, often people have different tasks. They're not working together. But it depends. But the point is that the shared task could have this kind of extra layer to the relationship. And that would go with givens, and we would do those things together, and that could create a feeling of community. Well, if you move to a voice-based society that is less task-based and you don't have givens, then the key to social capital is on the other side of anxiety. You have to now face the anxiety, which means you have to learn to use the voice because you're in a voice-based society, a listening-based, and you have to actually face anxiety because you can no longer get the same communal spirit in givens. And if you do it, you're going to have to isolate yourself. You're going to have to cut yourself off from the world, and therefore you get liberals are evil, conservatives are evil, small town, all the political ramifications, right? So we have to face the anxiety. If we face that anxiety, it creates energy. And like you say, you get this freedom, because one of the reasons why people can be scared to say do certain things in front of their parents or their family or whatever is because you have to see them again. And if it goes wrong, you can't escape it. And they're going to see what you do in light of it. So there's nervousness to do things that then you can't get away from, right? But with a stranger, you're like, well, if this conversation goes terribly wrong, then I won't see them again. But if it goes incredibly right, so it's all upside. This is my point. Like if you actually put yourself on the table of vulnerability with a stranger, in a weird way, the downside was the facing the anxiety. But when you get on the other side of the anxiety, then it's all upside. Because if it doesn't go well, you just don't see them again. So you get a clean slate, right? But you can't have that same dynamic with people in your immediacy that you're going to see again. But it is only on the other side of that anxiety that you get freedom. And then I think the other key, and this I think gets tied to Scholē, because the question becomes, what is Scholē? And I think also what you're talking about making constraints, it's tied to space making. And I'll go back to what we were saying on making a stage in a world where everything feels staged. There's something about Scholē that is a certain presence of energy. And I think one of the reasons why we actually get confused about Scholē when we translate it to leisure is because we understand leisure as a lack, like an absence of basically energy. Because energy is used for work. If I have energy, I'm working and I'm being productive, right? The problem is we don't understand energy as life. Like there's an experience of it. Most people's experience of energy is that which I use to do my job. Yeah. But they don't observe energy. And I think observing energy and observing time go together, because I think time is energetic. And what happens in a deep conversation is you feel what? An energy appears, right? I think to take seriously the idea of human beings as stewards is to take seriously the work of creating spaces, constraints, and conditions in which a certain energy manifests. And you should design the rooms of your house in such a way that this occurs. You should design the use of your time so that this quality of energy appears. And I think there's an entire art form of actually living one's life to create rooms and relationships and activities where this energy is more likely to appear than not. And that's part of the opportunity of this moment. And I think this is actually what it means for humans to be steward. Like when Genesis talks about being stewards, I think it's actually tied to creating conditions of this emergent energy that is what we long for. That's what everyone's longing for. That's what people want. They think they want a new car. What they want is an experience of this unique energy where everything feels more like itself. And conversation seems to be a unique place where people enter into that. And I do agree with Sam in the comments that conversation and language is actually moving you toward the beatific vision, which is beyond language. Because really in the social, like in that dialogus, in that circling, in that social coordination work, there's a moment which it is not merely the language that is holding you all together. It's the energy behind the language, that the language is skating along. It is skiing along it. But that energy is not reducible to the language, which then there's the work of actually being able to feel that energy as you walk to the garden or do the dishes or actually do anything, right? And the language can actually propel you in that direction. And then I do think you need the language in order to share that experience of energy and vision with other people who don't have it, right? Like to actually, and because if you give them the beatific, or to keep the beatific vision they get when they start to doubt it, right? Because that's the problem. Language has this role of helping you keep something you experienced, to help you remember something that you had that might slip away. But language needs to have a certain pointing role, a certain humble role, and like serve this in a certain way. But let me pause and throw it to Clayton here. Clayton, wonderful to see you, sir.
It's beautiful to be here. I'm glad I made it. There was an hour and a half there, which led to doubt. But yeah, one thing I want to add to all of that you've articulated beautifully is this other sense of like the purpose of the anxiety. I think we tend to want to treat it these days. We think it's a disease of some sort, but actually, to borrow your language, Daniel, it's like when the self-reflective negativity hits the saturation point, then it's the end of the individual. It's the end of the individual, and the biological response is to push you towards expanding to the collective, because your machinery, your nervous system has hit its point. So connect to another nervous system so that it can expand. You get a broader space to work with. It's basically that move. And usually, like, you see this like in therapy, like that's why people come therapy. It's like they're oversaturated, and what you're trying to do with them is to broaden that space and allow for the stuff that is plugged, let's say, in the experience, to have more space to stretch out. And as you do that, then they see it, because now there's space to see it. Like it's been stretched out more. Like it was so crumpled and it wasn't making sense because, well, it's saturated. And so, adding more space to it allowed to see what it is. And then now we can know what we're dealing with. And you don't have to tell them what to do. It's like the moment they see it, they know exactly what to do. They just couldn't see it. And but it's not just that. It's like it's happening to us all the time. It's like in the conflicts, because we're finite. We are limited by our biology. Like we tend to forget that when we're in a collective setting, but actually we are limited as individuals. And I don't think any one of us ever emerged in a non-collective situation. Like we all arrive in a collective. Like we all show up as a group of cells into a community of beings that are made of these groups of cells. And so it's always, you're showing up in that form as a collective entity into a collective entity, and there's a participation already happening, and it's calling you to respond a certain way. And so you're figuring out how to respond. And as you respond, you're developing this perspective. And eventually, then you start to build your propositions, but then the propositions start to trap you. And you start to rely on them too much. You think that they explain everything, but actually what you need to understand is the relation with the larger set, like how to expand your nervous system. And I guess so the anxiety is driving you back to that. It's like, yeah, you've reached the end of your limits, now expand. And when you expand, then it has all those payoffs of the trust, the stability, and the trust sort of like makes you feel safe, puts you in a place whereby, okay, I think the meaning here makes sense. All my senses are tracking it, so I don't need to question it. And I don't need to make sense of it because it has already made sense. And therefore, I can now just be. And as you're being, then all your fight systems now go offline, and then they just let you have an experience. But whenever that is failing, then they have to come online to push you back towards that. And of course, when you're trying to understand it cognitively and individually of course, it doesn't make sense. It feels like a disease that needs fixing for you to get back into your individuality. But actually, that's not where the solution is. It's on the other side. That's how all that's making sense to me, and I think there's something there. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I think this is very important. I think so, and then I'll give it to Seth here. So there's a very real way in which anxiety is the work of putting together a collective nervous system. Like, because if I can overcome anxiety, I can create a nervous system. A globally connected world is a world that is on the road of making a global nervous system. And the issue is we have, in a sense, all of the infrastructure there, but or maybe we'll say the nervous system, we'll say the internet, this is just to put it this way, the nervous system's the internet. But now there's the question of the electricity, like the brain electricity running through it, right? That electricity is created by the act of facing anxiety and not being destroyed by it, which creates the electricity. My claim, so a few more things. The pricing mechanism, money, a way to think about money, which money is a energy system. And Snyder, the Bitcoin guy, will talk about this and how one of the problems with fiat currency is it's an ineffective container for the money. Money is coordination, it's language, energy, and all of that, right? So there's a way in which I want to say that there's a Scholē-Energy that as the pricing mechanism coordinates the money energy, the social coordination mechanism coordinates Scholē-Energy. And that Scholē-Energy is also uniquely afforded by social capacity. So we know how individuals make energy. Eat food, go on a run, I make energy, right? But what if the social, like us being gathered, makes a new kind of energy that actually is found by talking, listening, facing anxiety? So if the social is real, meaning that what we are doing, there's been that idea that the social is not real, the collective is not real, just the individual, Margaret Thatcher, and so on and so forth. Now, I think that Ayn Rand, etc. Now, I think that view should not be discredited so quickly, because if you discredit that and you don't have a philosophy of energy and social coordination, you end up in collectivism, totalitarianism, and that's what Thatcher and Rand is talking about, right? So they wanted to defend the individual to stop us from ending up in totalitarianism. And they had a really good reason to do that because they saw how that would occur. However, you could say the individual was a stopgap to stop the development of totalitarianism until we got to the age when we had the social coordination mechanism of this infrastructure to make possible an unleashing of the individual into the collective that would be based not on the state, but fellowship. Right? Like Murray Rothbard and all those people said we got in trouble because we conflated society and the state. Society is not the state, is their argument. And there's this whole line of conservative thinkers, Brené Juvenel, I can go through the list, who basically argued that conservatism is supposed to be a defense of the social as distinct from the state. Now, this is classical liberalism and all of that. But here's the problem. And Hayek realized this. They had no way at all to keep the social from collapsing into the state. The only way to do it was to defend the individual. Well, okay, so they defended the individual, but that led to atomization. And that got us by through the Cold War and like 20 years after the Cold War. It no longer works. So now you have to regain the social as distinct from the individual and distinct from the state. This is the Juvenel middle. This is the political move of our time. The reclaiming of the social. That is the work. That is the most important work in all of politics on planet Earth. That is a massive claim. I'm making it. The regaining of the social as distinct from the individual, but not equivalent to the state, is everything now. If we do not do this, we will be replaced by AI. We will be disabled, Nick Land, all of that stuff, right? The reason we didn't do that and went to the individual like Rand and neoliberalism and all that was because there wasn't the technology in place for the defense of the social that was global local, as Michelle Bowens would say. We could only defend the social in terms of the immediate, but the problem with doing that is you ended up in isolationism, banality of evil, political extremism, and so on. So you need the quality of the social that is not isolationist. We haven't had the technology to do that. But if you don't have the social, you're screwed, to put it simply. So We're regaining the social. And here's the trick. As the individual creates energy, we know the individual creates energy. I would argue the social is real and it creates energy. The social creates energy. And that energy is what you're feeling in a geopadic, a circling, and a conversation where you get depth. You get an energy that you can't make for yourself. You do it in now. You can, after you learn it and access it and do the work, you can like access it as in walking through the field. But there's an energy that is afforded by community that is not afforded by eating a sandwich. Eating a sandwich can make energy for the individual, but the social energy that I'm describing, because I think Scholē is an energy. I almost want to say Scholē-Energy with a hyphen. That energy is learned in the social. But you need to coordinate a certain kind of social that can hold the container. Listening, speaking, they have enough diversity to make it unique so it goes together and it generates something. If you create the conditions of holding that, it's like creating a battery. You generate Scholē-Energy. And here's the kicker. I would argue that Scholē-Energy has always been what in history created wealth. It's always been the secret sauce of non-zero sumness. It's what gave us technological revolution and gave us culture and gave us everything. It's been coordinations of Scholē-Energy, which for most of history has been random and luck-based and happened to be here, and we don't know why. It's just that people intuited they should do something, and they did, and it just happened to generate the Bloomsbury. It just happened to generate the freaking Great Enrichment because people were following in an intuition that this stuff mattered. They couldn't explain it, but they followed it, and that created the conditions of the Scholē-Energy that changed the world. And so we haven't been able to, and then I'll give it to Seth. We have not in history been able to effectively coordinate Scholē-Energy. Scholē-Energy is what makes the world wealthy, not just in the materialistic sense, in the full sense of being a human being. And it is in the full sense of that wealth that we create the best businesses, create the best technology, and solve the most problems that are not reductionistic and isn't just financial capitalism or whatever. Scholē-Energy is what enriches. The reason it's been random is because we haven't had a means to coordinate it. Now we do. So now we're basically able to make kind of batteries of social collectives, of groups that are able to make this energy that changes how people are, what thoughts they're able to think, what ideas they're able to have, what things they're able to do in their life. And that creates real wealth. And now we have that. And basically, the political revolutionary act of our moment is to invest in that and to believe in that and to do that continually as a faithful present for the rest of our lives, because that can change the world. Anything short of that will be a Band-Aid. But let me pause and throw it to Seth. Seth, please.
Yeah, well, actually, what you just said is something that I feel like on a personal level, I have gained more and more faith in over the last few years. Like, oh, maybe I could organize my life based on what feels good to me, what tends to be the things I do where I receive appreciation. And I like receiving appreciation better than like feeling unappreciated. You know, and I've just been sort of reflecting on this whole conversation, you know, just in terms of like that classical or that classic question, like, what is my purpose? Well, it's sort of like what inspires me or what I like to think about, but it's also a question of energy. Like, how could I wake up every morning and do something that feels good and have the energy to wake up again the next day and repeat it? And, you know, so as I was thinking sort of, I guess, over my own life and some of what's been talking about, just if I use some broad categories, at different points in times, I've worked in the service industry. And within the service industry, I've done things that I hated versus I've done things that were kind of enjoyable. I've done things where the whole time I was on the clock, basically, I had to be doing something. I've also had jobs like I was a proofreader once, and at another point was a taxi driver. And both of those jobs had tons of dead time. I mean, the taxi driver, you only got paid every time someone got in the cab, but when I was a proofreader, I was paid by the hour, but half of the time I was writing music because it was just waiting for the next job to come in. And then something that I've been sort of sitting with more recently, like broadly speaking, I suppose these days in relation to the economy, I'm an entrepreneur because I'm, you know, creating my own schedule, defining my own services. I'm in charge of putting them out into the world. In terms of what my services are, broadly speaking, I'm kind of a teacher. So what I'm offering is information. Do people find the information valuable or not? Although it's interesting because I think a lot of what I'm offering, it's great to see you guy here today. Hello. Is you know, just is relationship. You know, people. And I like the way you just framed it, Daniel. Like, of course, we all need relationship to belong. We all need relationship so we don't feel lonely. But also, we need relationship in order to access the energy flows of the world that we live in. And if we don't, you know, have it, then we're trying to like bootstrap everything, and that's just like ultimately, you know, it's hard not to feel nihilistic because it's such a I'm always going uphill. But so, within this container of I'm an entrepreneur and I'm a teacher and maybe I'm working with relationship, well, okay, now it's all up to me. How do I define it? And again, I can tell you like what I'm interested in and stuff, but it's also like, how do I define my energy streams? Now, I've realized that there's one stream of energy in me that I come alive that if I gave it a name as an archetype, it would be the artist. Like there's some attraction I have to beauty, and, you know, like I have a client I work with, and on the surface, my job is to help her feel better in her body. But she'll often say something in appreciation for creativity when we work together. And then when I hear that, oh, my creativity is being appreciated, that's like an extra bonus for me. Like I get energy when she says that to me. On the other hand, I have a real history with this. There's a part of me that's a kind of an activist. And the activist really comes online, like when we were talking before about the 7 companies or whatever, which is just like, fuck this. This is, you know, like it shouldn't be like this. The way that the energy is flowing is wrong. Need to do something about it. I mean, even as I say this, I can feel like the energy of anger, which as I understand it, if there's this woman, Vivian Dittmar, who has, she creates something she called the emotional compass. And she said all the emotions are neutral, but we can use them as a social power or we can use them in shadow. So anger, you know, we tend to think of the shadow of destructiveness, but anger as a social power is that thing which wants to right what's wrong. And she'll use the example, if you drop a spoon on the floor, it's anger that helps you pick it up and, you know, put it, you know, in the sink or whatever. But it's funny, so if I'm sort of sitting around going, well, what should I do with my time? Should I be an artist? Should I be an activist? There's a way that even those two parts of me, and of course I'm speaking in very broad terms with all of this stuff, but there's a way that the activist and the artist can feel like they're in conflict, right? Oh, you just want to go make, you know, beauty. Meanwhile, the world's on fire and you're not doing anything about it. Versus like, oh, you're just out there in the streets, like venting your emotions, and you're missing everything that's good about life, and you know, like, and so yeah, I'm just speaking in very general terms, but it's something like we did the conversation recently with Aspasia, and one of the comments on the video that really struck me said something about the vision of the conversation. And I thought, oh, that's a really interesting way to think about the outcome of a conversation. Like I show up in the net, I don't know what we're going to talk about, but you know, I was over here making dinner and listening to you all guys. And like, I was thinking in a certain way because of what was being said. So there's like this kind of vision that emerges from the conversation. And if I'm just like, you know, scrolling around on YouTube looking for podcasts, it's like, oh, which vision, you know, appeals to me, which, you know, even just on that level of picking a video and listening to it, it's like, which one really activates the energy, you know? Maybe if I'm feeling more like an artist today, I'm going to listen to one video, or I'm feeling more like an activist, I'm going to listen to the other one. But just sort of extrapolating from my personal kind of ponderings about myself, I also wanted to use this, I know this rough framework I'm putting together here, and just like project it, maybe don't know how fair it is to do it, but onto the macro. This question that Daniel, you've been talking about, you had that one conversation at VoiceCraft, like where are we headed? what's going on right now? And like everyone's wondering. But what I'm imagining is, however sophisticated people are in terms of economics or politics or, you know, following this kind of conversation, what I imagine is that there's more overall nervous system dissonance in the world, right? And at a certain point, I mean, of course, that can lead to frustration, but at a certain point, I think it can lead to that more like that anger as a social power. Something is wrong here and it has to change. And of course, it's really hard if what has to change is me working for this 9-to-5 job that secures me a paycheck. But I think, you know, you can get to that point where it's just like, even though this pays the rent, it's driving me insane. And I will probably break down in some other way, even if my finances stay together, if I keep doing that. You know, or politics, like what we touched on briefly. I mean, the whole situation that's come up since this motherless website has been, you know, exposed, and just like the total just breakdown between men and women, which has been there forever, but it's like it's really, I feel it's being thrust out into the open. Anyway, there's a lot you could say about that, but I just bring it up as one more example of how I think that like feels like energy flows are. Yeah, I just wonder, you know, to the degree like John Vervaeke talks about the meaning crisis, and a lot of people can trace that back to, you know, is there a God or not, and these kinds of questions. But I also just imagine that for a lot of people, there's almost like an energy crisis. Like I'm talking about the energy that flows through me. And we've also talked about this, how to really be able to be in some kind of flow with the insane situation we're all in right now is to master the art of letting energy go through me. But I mean, literally overwhelm is like the norm. Like how much of this funnel can I like, or this not funnel, like how much of this hose, you know, this fire hose can I drink from every day? And there's certain people that, you know, actually seem to drink quite a lot of it because it passes right through them. And then they come out the other side. Anyway, many different thoughts here. Hopefully there's a way they constellate into a whole, but that was interesting to me. The more I sort of was listening to the conversation and wondering about my own energy, I was just wondering, like, to what extent, leaving aside my own personal idiosyncrasies, are like most nervous systems stuck in this question of purpose versus energy that I'm sort of feeling. Yeah, so.
Absolutely magnificent. If the world is interconnected, the social is real. So the energy is being created and unleashed upon the average person, and they don't know what to do with it. It's not articulated, so it's destroying them. And a way you can avoid it is hikikomoriism, division, ideology, like separating, right? It's also not given what you should do with it. So then people are confused and it just blows up. Right. And this is kind of Gurdjieffian, as Luke will talk about. Right. So you have this energy that, because the social is real, the energy that is there, and it's blowing people up and it's destroying people. And I think the meaning crisis, I do think definitely the energy crisis is very real. It's either a complete lack of energy or an overwhelm of energy. We don't know to have it in the middle, because if you have it in the middle, that means you've channeled it towards something. And if you channel it towards something, you create meaning. Like meaning is created from a certain experience of energy. Like you can't just say, this is meaningful to me. It has to have a qualitative, energetic experience, right? Because I can say, there's one thing to say music is meaningful to me. It's an entirely another thing to be in that experience of the making of the music. What we find meaningful are not products, but processes that we are in the middle of, right? And when we say that music is meaningful, it's in the memory of that process that is energetic. And boom, yeah, absolutely. So there's an energetic process that has a quality that we say that is meaningful. Right. And the issue is, when I talk about belonging, the issue is we have not figured out how to bring meaning and belonging together. People get meaning in a way that alienates them from their community, or they get rootedness in their community, but they have to give up the thing that's meaningful. Right. And so what ends up happening is, how do you get belonging and meaning together? And if you do that, Sam, thank you for being here, and I'll run for dinner in a moment. But if we don't get meaning and belonging together, energy is going to destroy us. Right. Yeah. And also to everything you're saying, the reason why, for me, it's a really big deal, Seth, like in belonging again, I want to argue that basically work on the social coordination mechanism is an act of activism It is an act of creation, an act of relation, in the sense of if it is true that what actually politically needs to be done to change the world in a way to deal with our major problems is a regaining of the middle, the social, and this does it, then this has an activistic activity. Also, the major thing I want to argue is that this is extremely practical because the world has created wealth by this kind of engagement. There are two key things that make people stop doing this kind of work or give up on religion, give up on church or whatever. It's the ethical claim and it is the practical claim. What you're doing is unethical, or you're not doing anything to help people, or what you're doing is impractical and it doesn't matter. I am arguing that how you change the world is through exponential curves, not linear curves. It looks like you're doing nothing forever and then it's big. And the exponential curve requires a faithful presence, as in you keep doing it and believing in it over the long term. Longer than you think, but not longer than you fear. That's very important. It takes longer than you think to culture make, but not longer than you fear. It's some random number like 12 years, not 100. It's like 12. It's some random number. The two main reasons people give up on the work of faithful presence and culture making are ethical claims, ergo activism claims, or creative claims. If belonging again, and I'm biased obviously, can successfully argue, looking to history, there is very strong reason to believe that actually this work has positively ethical ramifications in terms of opening new political consequences, and it taps into an energy that has always been at the source of productivity, then doing this work, you are justified to do this work in terms of pragmatism and activism, actually. Far from activism and ethics and pragmatism being why you don't do this work, I would argue history gives us very strong reason to believe that this work actually addresses those things. And the problem is that, ironically, in the name of activism, people are doing things that keep from the realization of the justice they want. In the name of pragmatism and wealth, people are doing things that destroy wealth and destroy energy. And that, in a reason they've done it, is because collective ironies tend to reflect a lack of coordination technology. When you don't have a way to effectively coordinate the change you want to see, like people say, be the change you want to see. You can only do that with the social, and that means there's a way to coordinate the social. If that's not there, then you can be the change you want to see, but it will be local, which is better than nothing, and that's very important. But if we're in a globally connected world, you want a local difference to also be global. How do you do that without sacrificing the local? Well, you need a social coordination mechanism that brings together the global and the singular, that allows people to connect all around the world in their different common lives and have a quality of fellowship that can be found in no other way. I have more to say, but I will pause and I will throw it to Guy Senstock, Mr. Senstock.
So just picking up a bunch of different threads, like just thinking, I'm just kind of thinking with you about thinking Scholē as energy, right? Anxiety, relationship, activism, like having in mind this sense of I think it was Jordan Hall that talked about the opposite of ideology is relation, right? And this whole thing about energy and anxiety. But just to stick with the Scholē for a second, if somehow following the etymology of Scholē down, you actually end up having to think. You actually can't get to Scholē without thinking origin as well. Like, and it's a different sense of origin, right? It's not origin as we normally think about it, where it's like origin is that which arrives before everything else, right? It's kind of back there, the thing that happened first, right? But rather more of a like an origin in a vertical sense, where origin being that which always arrives already first, right? It always arrives first at being at the origin. And I think that's the shift in energy you're talking about, right? Like, and it's striking to me that energy seems to be, in the way that we think about it, like especially in the kind of biohacking world, right? Like energy is like really seen like very mechanistically, right? You take these things and and it totally like ignores that like energy has to do with your relationship with the environment, right? Like it's this engagement that and in fact I would say it's the self-enclosure of the body, right? Is where because the body's supposed to the body's the body when it's not occurring to be itself, right? It's like it's a room making for like the eyes are room making for the visual field, right? It's like it withdrawals in its openness. So it seems to me that like this sense of vitality and energy has everything to do with a reciprocal relation with the locality of your environment, especially. I mean, I notice this a lot when I'm like, I have to work and I am not inspired, like, and I'm just like fucking ADD as hell. Like, I go, all right, I'm just going to clean my desk, right? These simple things, right? And it's actually, there's something quite deep going on there when you think about it, because you're being a phenomenologist when you do that, right? Like, and this is the way I've learned how to do it to make it fun. Is I'll just look at the shelf, and I'll just kind of sit and just feel the shelf and me, and I'll just notice where I'm suffering when I look at it, right? And then and if you just pay attention to that, you just know exactly how to move things and what needs to do, right? And then you look back and you just see if there's any more suffering, right? And then it's where your suffering level will register a kind of order, right? In fact, the kind of order that then supports your inhabitants and thus the energy that comes out. There's something quite deep going on there. So there's that part. But I think this thing about anxiety is really, really profound. Like so I'll put it, to put it more like in psychological framing, family systems theory says that, like, talks about that intimacy has everything to do with anxiety tolerance. It's like they're one-to-one, right? Like, to the degree that you can actually tolerate anxiety and turn towards the other in your turning towards the other, right? It's to the degree that intimacy becomes possible. To the degree that you can't tolerate anxiety, right? It's to the degree that you'll like subjugate the other. You'll dominate, right? Or you'll submit, or you'll dissociate, right? These are all ways of not tolerating anxiety. And I was thinking about this too, of like, it's funny. A lot of people, when they get anxious, they fucking talk, and they talk and 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 talk. Where it's like, in some way, it's not just talking, right? It's not just shooting the shit. It's like, no, that we're talking about something different. I think it's like because in that sense, that incipient kind of talking, right? First of all, it's not addressing anyone, right? This is like Buber really kind of talked about this. And this is also, I think, where a lot of the energy starts to take form, right? Because it's like, if the origin of your speech isn't the other, I don't think it's real speech, right? In some sense. I don't even think there is speech without hearing the listening of another and the direct address to it, right? Because it's like, in fact, I kind of think about this like, if you really want to increase your vocabulary, don't study a bunch of words, right, in the dictionary. Like, start to really listen to people and address them, right? Because if you're addressing them, you're listening as ahead of yourself, and your speech is following the contours of the otherness before you, and you'll be drawing from words, and you'll go outside of your own capacity, like words. And it's that thing, right? That kind of engagement, which is where I think the sense of origin opens up, right? So yeah, those are just some thoughts. Wanted to bring those together.
Magnificent. I think that's magnificent. I think what you're saying on origin, Heidegger dwelling, I mean, cannot be overstated, because, like, why is it that people can associate getting meaning with the genesis or an origin story? I need an origin story in order to have meaning or to know my place in the universe. Critically, people will speak as if it's getting the beginning of a sequence. But really the key is that when I have an origin, I have a quality I can bring into every possible encounter to actually frame them. So, like, notice how people use Adam and Eve all the time to explain everything. So the origin actually has a very present origin, as that phrase goes. So it's like the origin becomes a way to make new anything I encounter. It has an originating. It can make original. Like when I encounter my marriage and I'm trying to understand it, I can bring in an origin to have an original experience of my marriage. So the bringing in origin makes a possibility of things that I like impasses or strongholds. I can make it original. I get an original, a new way to approach, and then I can get. It doesn't stop me so much, so I can keep going. What ends up happening when people don't have an origin, then they are more prone to end up in impasses, like things they can't get through, and they have nothing they can bring to that impasse to make it original, to change what it is and give them a new direction in regarding it. They can't frame it, because origin. The key is there's something about an origin that means if all things came from this, then this is in all things. And I need to see it. Like if everything comes from the fall, then the fall is in all things. The story of Adam and Eve is somehow in all things. And how, though, is it in all things? Well, there's a tension there. That tension is generative. So when you see things in light of the origin, it creates a tension that creates new thought that you otherwise may not have, and in a new approach and a new way of seeing. So I think that cannot be overstated, and that you could frick. The problem is capitalism lost its origin. It doesn't realize its origin is in Scholē, so it can't understand itself in light of that quality, and it's stagnating and dying and falling apart. Capitalism doesn't have an origin story. It's a problem. So it comes from creativity. So also too, on what you're saying, so there are two types, speaking, there's discourse, as the Frankfurt School will say, or what I also call Kafka-likeness, that leads to the imprisonment of the subject. Then there is rhetoric, as McCloskey says, or what I'll call voicecraft, that is the opening up of the subject. So it is not that language is necessarily good. It's that, in a sense, our fate is determined by the quality of our language. Like, is our language voicecraft? Is it rhetoric? Is it AB open? Or is it discourse, as Frankfurt, Adorno, and all those people meant? Unfortunately, we naturally drift to discourse, it seems. And we're in an age that lacks an infrastructure to coordinate relationships in a social that can train us into voicecraft, into circling, into the kind of speaking that you're talking about, that is necessary for the energy. Because here's another way to look at it. Voicecraft, rhetoric, as belonging to, is open. Kafka-likeness is closed. Okay. So because you're in a globally connected world, are brimming with energy. Because the social is real, even if you don't acknowledge it. So the social is real. Like, you're affected by what's going on in the world. You say, I don't care what's going on in the world. Oh, really? You feel it. Energetically, you darn well feel it, right? So the social is real. You can say you don't care what's happening in Iran or the Middle East or all these other stuff, but energetically, you feel it because it's in the people around you. It's on the street. You go outside. The energy absolutely reflects the globe, even if you're not aware of what's going on. So this energy is building up inside of you. And if you have discourse, it's going in and you blow up and you structure yourself like a Kafka novel. But if you have openness, voicecraft, then the energy goes out. And now you have the flow of energy. Energy, another thing, it's really important why to emphasize energy here, because there's an argument to be made that economics is the study of energy. Like, economics is energy. It's energy use. That's what it is. Like, there is no, everyone's finding this out with the Strait of Hormuz, right? Oh, there's no oil, there's no economy. Like, there's nothing. Like, energy is everything. So if this social coordination mechanism uniquely unlocks and effectively coordinates Scholē-Energy, that would be an economic renaissance, because it would be an energy renaissance. It would afford a new kind of enrichment that in history was never before possible. The problem is, and I would like to argue, it's do or die, because that energy is here now. It's here. So it's a question of, do we effectively coordinate it or not? Anxiety is here for the average person on planet Earth. We're all existentialists now, as Peter Berger says, right? So you put it beautifully, Guy. Anxiety can only be dealt with by becoming intimacy. You cannot get rid of anxiety. You can only sublate it into intimacy, which means you better figure out how. Oh, they didn't teach me. Yep, I guess you better figure it out. Like that, everyone's in a situation where they have to figure out how to make anxiety intimacy. They don't know how. That's what the social coordination mechanism is teaching, making possible, and incubating. And an intimacy creates Scholē-Energy, that then unlocks the fullness of the human being. There's more to say, because what you were just saying about cleaning the shelf, this is part of the secret. Michelle and I have been talking about this big time. Like, This is why so much of what we're talking about is environmental and architectural, because it turns out the reason why you want to clean your shelf, sounding like Jordan Peterson with the bed, the reason you want to do it is not because cleanliness is ethical. We do it because it's ethical, because we ought to. No, cleaning unlocks energy. If you move that chair from that side of the room to the other, like all of life is a mystery. Wow, there's actually energy everywhere that is mysteriously unlocked if I do things. Add lights here, move chair there, talk a little different. Energy appears. Energy, we have this, I'll throw it to Michael here. We have this image of energy as something you start the day with, you go and it's like this. It's a curve. It goes down, right? Scholē-Energy or spiritual energy or the different ways you want to put it, it's mysterious. It comes and goes like the spirit. It bursts onto the scene. You move the chair and there's energy. You clean yourself and there's energy. And now you can do that thing. Like part of life is a great mystery of looking for the energy all around you don't see. It's part of beauty. Beauty and energy go together because when you strike beauty, you get energy. Like everything around, all phenomenon around you can be operated with and worked in a way to create a condition where energy appears. And the human as the steward is finding that energy and unlocking it and how they talk, how they speak, how they do their shells, what kind of lighting they have. All of these things is the art. There is an entire art of being human that is stewarding, that is the art of unlocking the energy around you for yourself and others. That is what everyone longs for. That experience of energy is what everyone's here to, that's what they long for. That's what they want. And that's what they spend their life finding, even if they don't know it. I will pause and throw it to Michael here. Michael.
Yeah, this point about, and I know I popped in, so I don't know the larger conversation around origin. I found that really interesting though. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how I think like just from like a therapeutic context, like a lot of people who come in who are either anxiety is usually of kind of existential fear, like what is my place in the world, where do I belong, what is my value, or the value that other people are telling me doesn't really feel ultimately satisfying and grounding. And it's this lack of a narrative of someone's life and an arc towards the future that they feel like energized, and you talk about fittedness, Daniel, like a lack, like it's not always just like that they don't have a narrative for themselves. It's often that the narrative that they do have they don't feel fitted to, right? Like there's something about it that doesn't feel right. And so it can be very powerful to have people kind of see their life in the context of like their family systems, the systems that they're in. People often have these like revelatory moments of like, oh, like that thing that I always do, or that way that I think about myself is actually from dad or from mom. It's not like innate to me. And people can kind of deconstruct and construct a new but then I think there's like, at least for me in my therapeutic process, like there was a point where I was like, okay, so I feel like I now kind of have a personal arc to my life. I have an understanding of where I was, why the suffering that happened to me happened. It gives me this purpose and meaning, understanding, but like it still doesn't really wed me to my culture and to my broader world, like it doesn't make me like it doesn't help me to place myself within the larger kind of meta crisis and kind of just the cultural moment that we're in, right? And I think this like discussion around origin is like helping me understand like exactly why that is. It's because we don't have a larger cultural origin point, or the ones that we do with the the major faiths. It's like that's kind of eroded to such a point where it's, and like if I just think about my own cultural context, like growing up in the Silicon Valley, like son of immigrants, most of the Silicon Valley are sons and daughters of immigrants who came from foreign countries for the tech boom. So it's like it's this new culture that's like kind of being built as we speak, and it is the capitalist cult. It's like the epicenter of like the the late stage capitalist culture, where it's like it isn't being inspired by this sense of like deep listening and deep attunement and love of beauty and these things that can really bind a culture. It's very much the chasing the American dream, but like kind of in my own silo, you know and yeah, there's it really seems like to kind of rediscover or discover anew what that origin point is. Like we have to get underneath these layers of discourse, because the origin points of what binds us as human beings is like much more fundamental than that. And um yeah, I was curious what your thoughts are on with your ideas on global pluralism and belonging again, because the low hanging fruit is for us to like go back to these origin points, right? To go back to the Christianity, to go back to the Islam, to go back to the Hinduism, and that I mean that is what a lot of people are doing, and that is working for a lot of people. But like it's like John Vervaeke talks about, like neither utopia nor nostalgia. Like pure nostalgia is also, we can't just go back to living in tribes that are demarcated by our religious affiliation. So how do we it I guess what I'm saying and asking is, like, it seems like we both have to go back to our origins as humans and learn again how to communicate and how to um, find, yeah, how to encounter the girdle point and not be destroyed by it. Um, but also, there's something about this moment that in rediscovering that, we are also discovering something new at the same time. We're discovering a new origin point, origin 2.0, origin for the for the global pluralistic age. And how do we do that without, I don't know, stumbling across the wrong thing, or letting it get to our heads and making new gods and idols about what we discover on the other side of that. Like yeah, these are all things that I think of. Last thing before I pass it back, like I was just in a men's circle this morning, part of Jacob Kashir's men's circle, and someone was talking about how they grew up in a high control religious group that thought the Reverend Moon was the Messiah, and they lots of trauma as a result of that, and basically think that all religious groups are cults. And it's like, of course, like you go through something like that, and that's what you think. And he and his partner are kind of trying to construct their own faith, and dabbling in, different pagan religions, but he says that's been really beautiful in a lot of ways, but there's also a lot of grief because he doesn't have a tradition to go to rely on. He doesn't have a community, and he doesn't really feel like the ones that offer that are tenable for him. And I think that's what a lot of people, that's where a lot of people are at. And so the Adam and Eve origin point is like not, or it's going to take a lot of work, but potentially multiple generations of like healing, right, for people to get there. And so what do people do in the interim is, I wonder that.
Oh, this is big. I completely agree, and forgive me, I'll have to run. I appreciate everyone being here. Critically, beauty, energy, and the social are phenomenologies of origin. When you experience the beautiful, you also experience a kind of origin that originated me. Like when you have this energy, that Scholē-Energy, you feel like, oh yes, this is actually the root of all things. If origin is not at the beginning of a sequence, then it should be accessible in any possible moment. The question is, what is origin? Also, there's something about the social, that when you create the social in the way that we are, that this is origin, because humans are social animals. So the problem is we haven't been able to actually regain the social in that sense because we haven't had the coordination mechanism for it. And I think what's happening is we need to find the origin ahead of us. Like we have to find the origin now that we can experience immediately, right now. And that's been done by making spaces, that by making constraints where you have an experience, you need an experience that feels like that this somehow is actually the origin of all things. And basically we've used myths and stories. I don't mean myths in a bad way. We've used myths to articulate an origin, but now we're in the age where we must experience origin. And I think beauty does that. I think energy does that. And I think the experience of the social does it. That's the only way to overcome this problem. Otherwise, you must have everyone ascribe to an origin story, and it brings all those problems you're describing, right? So this is the age of experiencing the origin, and we have to create the conditions of possibility for that. I do think it can be done. May you have a wonderful afternoon. All the best. Thank you so much.